Chapter 499. Li Tianlan's eyes turned between the silent Wang Tianzong and the silent screen, and he did not speak. Wang Tianzong's meaning was very simple. In desperation he did not care much about the strength of the Shadow Throne. Only the life and death of King Tong and Paul were his bottom line. Li Tianlan was thoughtful. With Wang Tianzong's current status, even if he was in a mess now, he would not intimidate him. He said that was the bottom line. That was the bottom line. And Li Tianlan believed that Wang Tianzong did not just say this to him. At this moment even Jianghu State knew this sentence. It was like a threat but also like a deal. Wang Tianzong could be imprisoned here because he obeyed the rules and did not want to touch the bottom line of the entire Jianghu State. So what he meant by this sentence was that he did not want Jianghu State and Li Tianlan to touch his bottom line. This completely showed that the relationship between the Wang family of Beihai and Rothschild was far deeper than what everyone saw. Otherwise Wang Tianzong would not have done such a thing to threaten Jianghu State. This sentence undoubtedly put Li Tianlan in a difficult position. The situation tonight was completely dominated by Li Tianlan, and he had no choice but to advance. If Paul and King Tong did not die, Li Tianlan would die. But now Wang Tianzong stood here with a calm face. If Paul and King Tong died, Li Tianlan would also die. Li Tianlan could only throw the problem back to Wang Tianzong. He could not kill Paul and King Tong. He could also not kill the Dark Knights in the Qing clan. But if the Vatican killed them, if the Heroes Club killed them, or if the Fantasy World and the Men in Black killed them, would Wang Tianzong put the blame on Li Tianlan? This sounded unreasonable, but the problem was that Li Tianlan really did not know the answer. When Wang Tianzong made his bottom line clear, other forces killed Paul and King Tong. If Wang Tianzong took action, Li Tianlan and he would both suffer losses. But after weighing the pros and cons, Li Tianlan was still more seriously injured. Because Wang Tianzong would directly kill him. He might be held accountable by the furious Jianghu State afterward, and the Wang family of Beihai might pay a high price. But when he made his bottom line clear, Li Tianlan touched his bottom line first. So, in the essence of this matter, who on earth violated the rules of the game first? Li Tianlan looked at the screen quietly and said nothing. He was waiting for Wang Tianzong's answer. That fear and nervousness began to rise from his heart once again, spiraling continuously and finally occupying his senses. Wang Tianzong was motionless. But in Li Tianlan's mind, Wang Tianzong was a storm that could easily swallow him and even the entire office of the president. This storm was very gentle, but it was extremely oppressive and biting cold. After a long time, Wang Tianzong slowly withdrew his gaze from the screen. He glanced at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was also looking at him. Both of them looked at each other calmly. "I'm done." Wang Tianzong said, "I don't want to watch this play." He slowly turned around and left Li Tianlan's room. Li Tianlan sat still, but for the first time, his face became extremely gloomy. He said that he would not kill Paul and King Tong. But he didn't say that others wouldn't kill them. It was impossible for Wang Tianzong not to know such an obvious word. Li Tianlan just wanted to test Wang Tianzong's attitude. If someone else killed King Tong and Paul, what would he do? But Wang Tianzong's attitude was that he had no attitude. He didn't take Li Tianlan's word game to heart at all. He walked into the room, said his bottom line and then left. He wasn't here to negotiate. All of this was like an order or a notice. Wang Tianzong didn't care about the Shadow Throne. He didn't even care about Li Tianlan who imprisoned him here. What he cared about were the rules. And within the current rules he would not leave the office of the president, nor would he allow King Tong and Paul to die. That was all. Li Tianlan's face was livid. Wang Tianzong's every move made him feel the arrogance. His notice was so clear and straightforward. What Li Tianlan felt from it was only the other party's contempt. Li Tianlan took a deep breath and managed to ease his expression. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He bit the cigarette but hard and looked at King Tong and Paul on the screen in a daze. Wang Tianzong didn't answer his question. So Li Tianlan didn't know how he would react if someone else killed King Tong and Paul. He wasn't sure if he didn't know. It was because of his uncertainty that Li Tianlan suddenly felt extremely great pressure and scruples. "Let's just kill him." A clear and calm voice suddenly rang out. A pair of white and tender little hands appeared on Li Tianlan's shoulder. Dongqing Rushi gently kneaded Li Tianlan's shoulder with a peaceful face. Li Tianlan's tense body slowly relaxed under Dongqing Rushi's kneading. He leaned on the sofa tiredly, shook his head and said with a wry smile, "How?" "I have silence," Dongqing Rushi said. Her martial arts seemed to belong to Jade Pool. But if it was divided in detail, silence, the famous sword of Jade Pool, was her real path. Her practice was simple and pure. She practiced the sword intent left in the silent sword by the previous generations of invincible sword masters of Jade Pool. She was the same age as Li Tianlan. They were born on the same day in the same month of the same year. Dongqing Rushi, who was 22 years old, was now almost close to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, as if she would break through at any time. If she could completely integrate the sword intent in the silent sword tonight, she could go straight to the invincible realm overnight. Of course, Dongqing Rushi couldn't do this. But now, she held the famed sword silence in her hand. The instant the blade was unsheathed, it was a truly invincible strike. Even if the power of this sword could not reach the peak of the invincible realm, once the majestic sword intent in the silent sword burst out, it would be comparable to the power of an expert in the middle of the divine list. In a sense, the special martial arts that Dongqing Rushi practiced limited the upper limit of her achievements, but it also made her a very special one. Dongqing Rushi held the famous sword silently. It was equivalent to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm with a murderous weapon. This was enough to make an invincible realm expert retreat. However, the murderous weapon consumed energy. Silence, on the other hand, consumed life force. No. Li Tianlan shook his head without hesitation. After a pause he said again, not enough. He couldn't let Dongqing Rushi pull out the sword. Dongqing Rushi's current realm was still a little low, but the sword intent of more than one silent sword master was left in the silent sword. Several kinds of sword intents came from silence at the same time. They didn't seem to be much different, but the subtle changes were extremely complicated. Dongqing Rushi wanted to use her own sword intent to barely control the sword energy and sword intent in the silent sword. Only when she reached the half-step invincible realm, and was infinitely close to the invincible realm, could she be seriously injured and not die after pulling out the sword. As for now, Dongqing Rushi barely pulled out the sword, and the possibility of survival was less than 10%. It was a situation of survival. And what could Dongqing Rushi do after pulling out the sword? The silent sword was an invincible realm expert. Li Tianlan himself was an invincible realm expert. Even if Qin Shilai and Raphael were here, plus Situ Tsangyue and Tribulation in Sai City, the six of them together would not be a match for Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong didn't even need to pull out the sword, including the master of Samsara Palace and Lin Fengting. These were the 8 invincible realm experts. Only when Lin Fengting, who was at the peak of the invincible realm, could Li Tianlan feel that there was a chance. Of course, there was a more secure lineup. If Deity of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital was added, or Deity could replace Dongqing Rushi, only then would Li Tianlan really want to give it a try. And all of this was without considering the rules. Even if Li Tianlan could really gather everyone and even pull Deity over, Wang Tianzong was the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State after all. How could he attack Wang Tianzong? Li Tianlan silently thought about his own lineup and Wang Tianzong's current realm. His heart suddenly became more depressed. Dongqing Rushi noticed his mood, and her movements became more and more gentle. There's one thing you have to remember. Li Tianlan stood up and looked at Dongqing Rushi. On this trip to Eastern Europe, you are not allowed to pull out the sword. You can't even have this kind of thought. Do you understand? Dongqing Rushi let out an ah, and looked at Li Tianlan in a daze. She looked silly. Don't play dumb with me. In such a serious situation, Li Tianlan still couldn't help laughing. He reached out and pinched Dongqing Rushi's soft face. He said with a smile, if you dare to be disobedient, I don't want you anymore. He got up and walked out of the door. Where are you going? Dongqing Rushi suddenly asked. Li Tianlan paused and chuckled. I just asked His Majesty the Sword Emperor a question, but he didn't answer me, so I can only go and ask again. He pushed the door open and walked out. Wang Tianzong's residence was next door, separated from Li Tianlan's residence by a courtyard. Passing by the garden in the courtyard, Li Tianlan stood in front of Wang Tianzong's door and stopped. He asked the question once and now he asked it again. This was really a little embarrassing. However, Li Tianlan's face was still calm. He reached out and was about to knock on the door. Come in. Wang Tianzong's voice sounded in the room. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes, took a deep breath, pushed the door open and walked in. Wang Tianzong sat on the sofa in the living room, with a pot of tea on the tea table in front of him. Hearing Li Tianlan come in and close the door, Wang Tianzong did not look back but asked calmly, What's the matter? Yes. Li Tianlan sat opposite him, reached out to take the teapot, and poured himself a cup of tea. Go ahead. Wang Tianzong's tone was light. Li Tianlan thought for a while, and he did not ask this question in any way without losing face. It was a little embarrassing to ask this question again. So Li Tianlan came straight to the point. I won't kill King Tong and Paul. He looked into Wang Tianzong's eyes and said sincerely, but if someone else kills them, will you kill me, your majesty? Wang Tianzong froze and looked up at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was also looking at him, and his eyes became more and more sincere. Wang Tianzong finally laughed. He seemed to find the current scene very interesting. Are you afraid? Yes. Li Tianlan looked at Wang Tianzong's smile and laughed himself. I'm scared to death. The picture on the screen kept changing. Dongqing Rushi, who stayed alone in the room, looked at the picture that was enough to make anyone in the dark world extremely nervous. She was in a daze. Li Tianlan had been gone for nearly 20 minutes. Dongqing Rushi thought for a moment, stood up, and made a cup of strong tea for Li Tianlan. Tonight was destined to be a sleepless night. Li Tianlan didn't sleep, so she didn't want to sleep either. So she found some snacks and put them on the coffee table. The picture on the screen changed silently. Dongqing Rushi took a handful of melon seeds and stared at the screen with wide eyes, as if she was watching a modern war fantasy drama. The door was pushed open from the outside. Dongqing Rushi stood up subconsciously, grabbed a handful of melon seeds and whispered, "You're back." Her voice suddenly disappeared, and her delicate eyebrows frowned slightly as if she was recalling something. A middle-aged man she had never seen before came in from outside the door, but she was very familiar with him. The man's appearance was ordinary, but his face was very clean. He was dressed in a black casual suit that seemed to be everywhere. His expression was gentle, and he walked in slowly. His ordinary appearance didn't make Dongqing Rushi feel any aura. But Dongqing Rushi's body tensed up reflexively. This man was too simple. He was so simple that he became real. With his appearance, everything in the room seemed to become fake. Only he was real. The most real person. The simplest person. Dongqing Rushi didn't say anything, nor did she warn him. She just stared at the man who was very familiar but also very strange. The middle-aged man didn't seem to expect to see Dongqing Rushi in Li Tianlan's room. A touch of anger and complexity flashed through his eyes and he whispered, "You live together? You are?" Dongqing Rushi looked at him and asked in a daze. The man frowned quickly and then smiled. He asked in a gentle voice, "You really don't know me?" Dongqing Rushi's countless memories kept changing, and finally stopped in a certain picture. It was a few days before the final battle in Heaven Capital more than 3 years ago. When he and several other young people from East Emperor Palace were besieged by a prince of East Island, Dongqing Rushi also wanted to draw her sword in desperation. However, that sword was forcefully pushed back by someone. The most obvious thing in Dongqing Rushi's memory was the man's eyes. They were clean, clear, simple, gentle, and kind. "You," he hesitated for a moment. "You saved me in East Island more than 3 years ago. I'm not a bad person." The middle-aged man said softly, and a touch of disappointment flashed through his eyes. Of course, that was not what he wanted to ask. He asked Dongqing Rushi if she really didn't know him, and he wasn't asking Dongqing Rushi. He was asking another personality in Dongqing Rushi's body that had been silent for a long time. "How did you get in?" Dongqing Rushi was a little curious. The man was undoubtedly a strong man. But the defense in the office of the president could not be explained by a strong man. The reason why Wang Tianzong was imprisoned here, in addition to abiding by the rules, was that he couldn't leave here quietly without being discovered by the Snowdance Corps. In other words, Wang Tianzong couldn't get out, and the people outside couldn't come in quietly. Unless the other party was stronger than Wang Tianzong. In this way there was only one possibility. "You have people in the Snowdance Corps?" There seemed to be a sharp light in Dongqing Rushi's eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Purgatory of Heaven Capital." The middle-aged man smiled. "Deity." Dongqing Rushi's eyes were still clear, but the look in them suddenly became extremely vigilant. "Don't be nervous. After all, I saved you. You know I mean no harm, right?" Deity looked at Dongqing Rushi and his eyes were a little dazed. Dongqing Rushi was silent for a while, and then she asked softly, "What brings you here?" Of course, Deity had something to do. But he didn't talk to Dongqing Rushi, but to Li Tianlan. However, as he walked into the office of the president, he suddenly found a very important problem that even made him a little uneasy. This problem became something new. He looked into Dongqing Rushi's eyes and said softly, "Little girl, can you tell me where the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps went tonight?" Dongqing Rushi froze for a moment and looked at the screen subconsciously. Only then did she find that from the outbreak of the war in the Caesar Hotel to the present, the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps had not appeared on the battlefield even once. Not a single high-level member had appeared. Where did they all go? Dongqing Rushi was silent for a while and suddenly said seriously, "They went to eat." Jianghu State. Hidden Dragon Sea. Jinqiu Pavilion. When the Invincible Realm battlefield in Reki City completely began, it was already the afternoon of August 18th in Yuzhou. The atmosphere in Jinqiu Pavilion was solemn. The satellite of Jianghu State had connected to the signal of Wulan State. On the screen in the study of Jinqiu Pavilion, the battlefield in front of the Caesar Hotel in Reki City was playing. The picture was slightly delayed, but it did not affect President Li Huaqing's analysis of the situation. This man, who could be said to be the most powerful in Jianghu State, frowned and stared at the screen. Suddenly he said, "Is all this Tianlan's plan?" "Yes." Beside Li Huaqing, Dongqing Wudi, who was in military uniform, nodded with a calm expression. "The plan is too big and too urgent." Li Huaqing frowned tightly. "In the war, it's a big taboo to advance rashly. Since Eastern Europe has become chaotic, how can it be restored overnight? What Tianlan should do now is to defend Reki City and slowly digest the results. It's not surprising that such a big scene will drag on for 2 or 3 years. Why is he in such a hurry?" Dongqing Wudi did not speak. The chaos in Eastern Europe involved so much that it had affected the entire Dark World. Li Huaqing was right. In such a situation, it was not surprising that it would drag on for 2 or 3 years. But the problem was that everything was ready in Tianan. Li Tianlan could not afford to delay. Moreover, Qin Weibai had prepared for so long. Qin Weibai could not afford to delay either. 2 or 3 years. 2 or 3 months were a little too long. The intelligence of the Samsara Palace is still very accurate. Since Tianlan dares to use the intelligence of the Samsara Palace to make a layout, he must have some confidence. Let's just wait and see. Wait and see. Li Huaqing shook his head silently. You should know Tianlan's character. He has just started, unlike us. Now he will not leave himself any leeway at all. If there is a chance, he will put all his strength on it at once. What he believes is that a lion fights a rabbit. This style is naturally crazy enough, and many things can be solved swiftly and decisively. But leaving no leeway is a big taboo after all. This means that he can't make any mistakes in any link. Otherwise it will be either a big victory or a big defeat. The plan tonight is too big and involves too many things. Who can be sure that there are no mistakes in Tianlan's plan? I don't think he can be sure himself. Dongqing Wudi was silent for a while. Even if he trusted Qin Weibai very much, he could not believe that Qin Weibai's intelligence would not be wrong. Any mistake in the intelligence provided by Qin Weibai could be very fatal to Li Tianlan's plan. Things have come to this, Dongqing Wudi said slowly. I can only hope that everything goes well. Li Huaqing was silent for a long time, then shook his head with a bitter smile. I hope so. The light in the study suddenly jumped. The picture on the screen began to change. An extremely elegant and graceful figure appeared on the screen. The woman's face had completely defeated the years. She wore no makeup, but she was indescribably dignified and beautiful. She was smiling. Facing the 2 most powerful bigwigs in the chaos of Jianghu State, she was not nervous at all. She just smiled softly and said, Mr. President, Minister, long time no see. Li Huaqing and Dongqing Wudi looked at each other and saw confusion in each other's eyes. This woman was very familiar. But maybe it was because they had seen her so few times that they couldn't remember where they had seen her for a while. Qinzong asked me to pass on a message to you too. He hopes that you can communicate with Marshal Li. The woman's voice became softer and softer, like a spring breeze. Summer solstice. Li Huaqing finally reacted and subconsciously raised his voice. Summer solstice smiled and bowed slightly. I will arrive in Yuzhou within 3 hours. Li Huaqing frowned and did not speak. Mrs. Wang just said that Tianzong asked you to pass on a message? What is it? Dongqing Wudi, who had been silent, suddenly asked. Tianzong asked me to tell you that he doesn't care about the Shadow Throne. But King Tong and Paul want to live. They must live. That's his bottom line. Marshal Li seems to have some misunderstanding about Rothschild, so Tianzong hopes that you can communicate with Tianlan. Rothschild is the most important ally of the Wang family of Beihai and has a lot of deep cooperation with Jianghu State. This is not a partner that we can easily give up. It's the bottom line, the real bottom line. Li Huaqing looked calm. However, Dongqing Wudi's face changed. The bottom line was the bottom line because it was something that could not be touched no matter what. He subconsciously glanced at Li Huaqing. Li Huaqing was still looking at summer solstice, and his eyes were a little wandering. Dongqing Wudi's heart sank slightly and he sighed secretly. After I arrive in Yuzhou, I will go directly to the Hidden Dragon Sea. We can talk about the details face to face then. Summer Solstice said with a smile. The corners of Dongqing Wudi's mouth twitched and he said with a smile, "Of course, madam is welcome." The video call ended. Li Huaqing was silent for a long time. Dongqing Wudi opened his mouth several times and finally snorted. Summer Solstice is at the peak of the invincible realm, right? Li Huaqing looked at Dongqing Wudi and said slowly, "This is their bottom line." Dongqing Wudi's face suddenly became extremely ugly. He nodded reluctantly, took out his mobile phone and said, "I'll call Tianlan now." Li Tianlan talked with Wang Tianzong for half an hour. As soon as he left Wang Tianzong's room, his mobile phone rang. Li Tianlan looked at his mobile phone and was a little surprised, but he still picked it up at once. "Minister, this is Li Tianlan," he said in a calm voice. When he said the first word, his expression had become completely calm. No one could see the result of the negotiation with Wang Tianzong from his expression. "Tianlan, I have a message here." Dongqing Wudi hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice. Li Tianlan asked directly, "What message?" "Summer Solstice." Dongqing Wudi took a deep breath and said, "The hostess of the Wang family of Beihai just video called me and the president." Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and looked back at Wang Tianzong's residence. He didn't say anything and listened quietly. Dongqing Wudi gritted his teeth. There were some things that were really not suitable for him to say with his identity. Not to mention the impact, it was a little hard to say. He glanced at Li Huaqing again and finally sighed. He said with a bitter smile, "The Wang family of Beihai asked us to keep Paul and King Tong alive. This is their bottom line." Li Tianlan listened quietly. Dongqing Wudi also fell silent. "How did you reply?" Li Tianlan suddenly asked. "It doesn't matter." Dongqing Wudi said calmly, "The most important thing is that Summer Solstice seems to be a little worried, so now she is on her way to Yuzhou. Within 3 hours she will enter the Hidden Dragon Sea. The president and I can't stop her from entering the Hidden Dragon Sea." Dongqing Wudi deliberately emphasized the word president. Li Tianlan frowned slightly. Dongqing Wudi continued to remind him, "Summer Solstice is also at the peak of the invincible realm." Li Tianlan completely understood what Dongqing Wudi meant. He suddenly felt a little ridiculous. How dare they? Don't you understand? It's not a matter of whether they dare or not. Dongqing Wudi smiled bitterly. Li Tianlan was silent. Indeed, there were some things that were not a matter of whether the Wang family of Beihai dared or not. It was a matter of whether some people dared to bear it. For example, President Li Huaqing. Now the academics and the giant group were in the honeymoon period of cooperation. But cooperation was only cooperation after all. It was for the expected benefits and some risks now. But once the risks of such cooperation were greater than the future benefits, it was conceivable how fragile such cooperation was. If Li Tianlan didn't listen to the advice and touched the bottom line of the Wang family of Beihai, who dared to put an expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Wang family of Beihai by his side? "I see." Li Tianlan gritted his teeth and his voice was a little cold. Dongqing Wudi sighed and hung up the phone. Li Tianlan stood where he was for a long time without moving. Only by standing in his current position could he truly understand how unbearable it was to be forced to compromise in the face of the general trend. This was the first time he had compromised. He had to compromise. If he insisted on killing King Tong and Paul, not to mention what the Wang family of Beihai would do, Li Huaqing would call him in person in the next moment and order him to keep Paul and King Tong alive. If things developed to this point, there would be a very obvious crack between the academics and the special exhibition group. This was not good for either side. But in contrast, Li Huaqing absolutely did not dare to let Summer Solstice stay in the Hidden Dragon Sea when he touched the bottom line of the Wang family of Beihai. This was the real threat. Chapter 500. Li Tianlan took a deep breath, as if he wanted to suppress all the depression in his heart. Before he grew up, he knew that the Wang family of Beihai was very strong, but he didn't know how strong it was. When he was so weak that he couldn't even touch the edge of the Wang family of Beihai, the whole Wang family of Beihai was like a vast sky. If he didn't go up to the sky, he naturally didn't know how high the sky was. Now he was the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world, Marshal Li or His Highness that everyone talked about, and the youngest marshal in the special warfare system of Jianghu state. This time he led the Snowdance Corps north to Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan's position could be said to be really high and powerful. He had seen part of the real strength of the Wang family of Beihai and was barely qualified to compete with it. It seemed that it was not until this moment that Li Tianlan truly realized the strength of the Wang family of Beihai. In the chaos, every step he took he felt extremely strong pressure. The Wang family of Beihai just blocked his way casually, which made every step difficult for him. On the date of death, facing King Tong, Li Tianlan could not shoot. In the end, he temporarily held the leadership of Wulan State and even successfully imprisoned Wang Qianzong here tonight. But that was only 2 steps forward on the long road. The Wang family of Beihai just took 2 steps back casually. But as the situation became more and more chaotic, when Li Tianlan really threatened the core interests of the Wang family of Beihai, Wang Qianzong showed his bottom line. Then summer solstice went to Yuzhou. Li Tianlan had to kill Paul and King Tong. This was an inevitable move. But he had already taken this step. Just as his foot was about to land, he was suppressed by the Wang family of Beihai and retreated again. At this moment, there was really no word to describe Li Tianlan's resentful and helpless mood. He didn't want to retreat, he didn't dare to retreat, but he had no choice but to retreat. Wang Qianzong could face anyone fearlessly because he was the Sword Emperor. He relied on the Wang family of Beihai, and the Wang family of Beihai also relied on him. They were one and shared honor and disgrace. But Li Tianlan did not grow to this stage. He could face Wang Qianzong directly because of his identity at this time. To put it bluntly, it was because of the support of the giant group and the academics. The Wang family of Beihai showed its bottom line. Summer Solstice, who had never left the Wang family of Beihai for more than 20 years, came to Yuzhou in person. All this would not make the giant group change its position, but it was enough to make the academics and even Li Huaqing hesitate. If King Tong and Paul died, of course, Summer Solstice would not dare to kill Li Huaqing. But that was not the point. Most importantly, Li Huaqing didn't know if the academy was willing to take on this risk. Dongqing Wudi's phone call had already explained everything. When Summer Solstice came to Yuzhou, if the academics could still stand firmly with the giant group, Dongqing Wudi would not have made this call. This phone call was made by Dongqing Wudi, but it was Li Huaqing's idea to implement it. If Li Huaqing did not support Li Tianlan could not kill King Tong and Paul. There had never been too many neutral stances in politics, especially during sensitive times. Once Li Tianlan couldn't get Li Huaqing's support, it meant that the Wang family of Beihai would get Li Huaqing's support. In such a situation, all of Li Tianlan's actions were not games but courting death. The cold night rain in Reki City fell wildly. Li Tianlan stood in the rain and smoked several cigarettes quietly before he calmed down again. The door of Wang Qianzong's room suddenly opened. Wang Qianzong stood at the door of the room and looked at Li Tianlan in the rain for a while. Suddenly he said, "Can't figure it out? How could it be?" Li Tianlan laughed. He looked at Wang Qianzong through the rain. The light in the room shrouded him, and there was a halo in the rain. Wang Qianzong's figure seemed a little blurred. Li Tianlan wiped his face and said calmly, "When I was very young, my grandfather told me that no one in the world can sing all the way. The Wang family of Beihai has such a deep foundation. As strong as you are, haven't you also compromised? I'm just a chess piece trying to climb out of the chessboard. The general trend is now in my hands, but not everything in the world is under my control. It's not necessarily a bad thing to take a step back." Wang Qianzong didn't speak. He looked at Li Tianlan with undisguised appreciation in his eyes. Li Tianlan slowly turned around and said flatly, "Good night, Your Majesty." He walked slowly to his courtyard. "Do you like Yuetong?" Wang Qianzong's voice suddenly sounded behind him, clear and steady. Li Tianlan's footsteps suddenly stopped. After coming to Eastern Europe, Wang Yuetong had never contacted him. But from the call with Li Beidian and Ning Qianqing, Li Tianlan knew that Wang Yuetong had followed them to Tianan. The little princess of the Wang family of Beihai, who dared to love and hate, had gradually changed. The former liveliness had begun to disappear from her. She began to meditate for a long time and began to focus on studying the various situations in Tianan. She began to become more and more silent. She had never contacted Li Tianlan or the Wang family of Beihai. If Li Tianlan could know this, how could Wang Qianzong not know? After a moment of silence, he asked in a cold tone, "What do you mean?" "Nothing." Wang Qianzong laughed. Maybe it was because the rain curtain was too wild and fierce, or maybe it was because the light was too warm, but his smile looked unprecedentedly gentle. "Don't get me wrong. No matter how despicable I am, I won't threaten you with my daughter." Li Tianlan was silent for a while and thought of Wang Yuetong, who had left Mount Dibing and come to his side. His imagination was really poor, so he couldn't imagine what Wang Yuetong should have looked like when she left Mount Dibing. "She didn't give up on you. She just gave up the grievances between the Wang family of Beihai and the Li family," Li Tianlan suddenly said. I know. Wang Tianzong nodded and said lightly, I'm just a little tired. After the things in Eastern Europe are over, I plan to take my wife to travel. She went to a lot of places when she was young, including Switzerland, England, France, the north and south of Jianghu state, but she didn't go to many places. For so many years she has never left Beihai, and even rarely left Mount Dibing. In fact, I know that she still wants to go back and see some of the scenery in the past. Look at the beauty she has seen before, look at the amazement she has never seen before. Wang Tianzong's voice was getting lower and lower until it was inaudible. His eyes were obviously in a trance. Looking at the rain, no one knew what he was thinking. Li Tianlan listened in silence, not understanding what Wang Tianzong meant. What do you think? Wang Tianzong suddenly asked. Very good. Li Tianlan nodded. It's quite enviable. If possible, he also wanted to take Qin Weibai, Wang Yuetong, and Dongqing Rushi to travel around the world, to see many sceneries he had never seen, to eat many delicacies he had never tasted, and to try how unrestrained the mortal world was without swords and sabers. But there were some things that he could not give up after all, at least not now. After I leave, what do you think will happen to the Wang family of Beihai? Wang Tianzong continued to ask. Li Tianlan was stunned and said through the rain, I don't understand what you mean. I'm leaving. The Wang family of Beihai needs a new patriarch. Who do you think is the most suitable? Wang Tianzong continued to ask. Li Tianlan frowned. He really didn't feel that his identity and position were qualified to participate in such a sensitive matter. So he shook his head and said bluntly, I don't know. Wang Tianzong nodded and suddenly said, How about Yuetong? Li Tianlan suddenly looked up at Wang Tianzong's eyes. Wang Tianzong's eyes were deep and peaceful, looking very sincere. I can repeat the question I mentioned before. Wang Tianzong said quietly, After the chaos in Eastern Europe is over, I will leave Jianghu state and Beihai with my wife. The position of patriarch will be handed over to Yuetong. If you are worried, I can go to the stage of formidable person and swear to the ancestors on the stone of formidable person that as long as the Wang family of Beihai is not in a crisis of life and death, I will never set foot on Mount Dibing. His voice was clear and calm. Obviously, it was a decision made after careful consideration. You come to the Wang family of Beihai and assist Yuetong with Xingxiao. You can also use the resources of the Southeast Group to rebuild the Li family. Your first child with Yuetong can be surnamed Li. If you want him to be surnamed Wang, he can be the next heir of the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Tianzong's voice was calm and indifferent, but in Li Tianlan's ears, every word was like thunder, making him dizzy. Of course, he knew about the stage of formidable person of the Wang family of Beihai and the stone of formidable person on the stage of formidable person. That was the most sacred place of the Wang family of Beihai. It was a holy land that the successive patriarchs of the Wang family of Beihai attached great importance to. If Wang Tianzong was willing to take an oath on the stage of formidable person, he would never break his oath. Li Tianlan couldn't imagine what kind of future he would have after such a thing happened. He really couldn't imagine it. I'm not giving the Wang family of Beihai to you. It's just that Yuetong should have her own responsibilities. Now she is obedient to you because the Wang family of Beihai has me in Xingxiao. With her temperament, if she really becomes the patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai, you can't influence her decision. With Xingxiao, Yuetong will not be your puppet. So I'm very relieved. And I really think that such a Wang family of Beihai will be the most powerful in the future, unprecedentedly powerful. Wang Tianzong said calmly. Li Tianlan believed this sentence. If he didn't believe this sentence, he didn't believe in himself. Once he joined the Wang family of Beihai, the Wang family of Beihai would have a heavenly son who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the ancestors of the Wang family of Beihai in the future. In addition, the Wang family of Beihai had Wang Xingxiao, Dijiang, and many young experts. With such a lineup, 10 years later, the Wang family of Beihai would once again reach the most glorious peak. 20 years ago, it could completely sweep the dark world, make thousands of enemies bleed and make heroes bow down. If that day really came, where would he be? Li Tianlan was in a trance and then came to his senses. What? He asked slowly. The future envisioned by Wang Tianzong was very likely to come true. But no matter how likely it was not reality after all. The reality was that the current Sword Emperor was invincible in the world. If Wang Tianzong took an oath, there would be no Sword Emperor in the dark world. Because I suddenly understood that the current Wang family of Beihai doesn't need the Sword Emperor. Wang Tianzong whispered, It's the future. You can think about it. He said slowly, As long as you nod, everything tonight will be completely reversed. You and I will be invincible in the world. King Tong, Paul, Violet, Morton, the Qin clan in Eastern Europe, and Rekvia. The four major families in Eastern Europe, Rothschild, the Wang family of Beihai, the Dark Knights, Samsara Palace, Sai City, the Giant Group, the Academics, and all the forces will completely stand by your side. This force can allow you to sweep the dark world tonight. I will personally kill all the invincible realm experts who can threaten your growth in the future. Li Qianlan's heart beat wildly. The wildfire in his heart was burning, unprecedentedly crazy and blazing. Wang Qinzong's meaning was obvious. The chaos in Eastern Europe would end. And it could end tonight. As long as he agreed to Wang Qinzong's invitation, he would immediately gather an extremely powerful force around him, which could even allow him to sweep away all the superpowers. The four major families in Eastern Europe would merge into a whole again, and the chaos would disappear. Wang Qinzong would personally kill the invincible realm experts of various superpowers. Maybe before tomorrow morning, Li Tianlan would become the master of Eastern Europe. He would become the most powerful person in the entire dark world. It was all complicated. But it was also very simple. It was so simple that he only needed a nod. You still have time to think about it? Wang Qinzong said calmly, but there won't be too much time. Tianlan is still young. He still has a lot of time. A clear and cold voice rang out. Amidst the heavy rain, there was a faint, natural fragrance. Li Qianlan's body shook violently, and he suddenly turned his head. In the heavy rain, a faint white figure appeared. She was graceful and picturesque. This kind of beauty was so dreamy and so perfect. She came over with an umbrella and covered Li Qianlan's head with it. She said softly, "Why are you getting wet here? You're so silly." Li Tianlan smiled. He was really a little silly. "How did you get here?" Li Tianlan subconsciously reached out and put his arms around her slender waist. "I called Rushi and then she picked me up." Qin Weibai rubbed her face in Li Tianlan's arms. Li Tianlan raised his head subconsciously. Sure enough, not far away, Dongqing Rushi was also standing there with an umbrella. She looked at Li Tianlan with her cheeks slightly puffed up as if she had been wronged. Li Tianlan was a little embarrassed and subconsciously let go of Qin Weibai, but he felt something was wrong. Before he could do anything, Qin Weibai suddenly put her arms around Li Tianlan's neck. The goddess was absolutely proud of her height of 1.76 meters barefoot. She was taller than Li Tianlan in high heels, so she did not stand on tiptoe. Instead, she lowered her head and took a bite on Li Tianlan's mouth. She whispered with a smile, "I missed you so much." Her lips moved and she suddenly said, "What tea did you drink just now?" Li Tianlan frowned and suddenly turned to look at Wang Qinzong. Wang Qinzong stood in front of the door, and his expression returned to calmness. "Don't drink this kind of tea in the future. It will distract you." Qin Weibai continued. Li Tianlan nodded and took a deep look at Wang Qinzong. "What I said just now still stands," Wang Qinzong said in a flat tone. Li Tianlan thought about it carefully and suddenly felt that the conversation between them just now became a little vague. He frowned, a little vigilant and even a little incredulous. "Did you hypnotize me?" His will was really perfect now. In theory, even if the Pope of the Vatican faced him in person, he should have the ability to protect himself. "Who can hypnotize you in your current mental state?" Wang Qinzong asked. No matter how good his mental state is, there are flaws. Tianlan was almost fooled just because His Majesty mentioned the people and things he cared about. Qin Weibai said calmly. "I didn't lie to him, so it's not fooled." Wang Qinzong shook his head. "I was just inviting him. An invitation can give people a choice." Qin Weibai looked at Wang Qinzong. His Majesty used such a means to make Tianlan agree. After tonight, everything is settled. When Tianlan wakes up completely, what choice does he have except to enter the Wang family of Beihai to assist Yuetong? Isn't that good? Wang Qinzong raised his eyebrows. "Of course not." Qin Weibai said tit for tat, "We are all Tianlan's women. When it comes to assisting, it should be us assisting him. If my man stands in someone else's position to help another woman, I will be jealous." Wang Qinzong suddenly glanced at Dongqing Rushi and said meaningfully, "Will you really be jealous?" Qin Weibai was in a trance and her face changed slightly. Wang Qinzong laughed. "You don't understand." Qin Weibai was silent for a while and then said slowly. Wang Qinzong stopped talking, just glanced at Li Tianlan and said slowly, "You can come to me when you think about it." Li Tianlan didn't say anything. Qin Weibai tidied Li Tianlan's collar and said softly, "Silly husband, some women are very proud. I'm like this and so is Yuetong. If you enter the Wang family of Beihai in Yuetong's eyes, you are working for another woman. Even if I can accept it, how can Yue Tong, who is proud, stand it? Li Tianlan was completely baffled. What did it mean that after entering the Wang family of Beihai in Yue Tong's eyes, he was working for another woman? Wang Yue Tong was the little princess of the Wang family of Beihai. What did it mean? Wang Tianzong took a deep look at Qin Weibai. Perhaps he was the only one who vaguely understood what Qin Weibai's seemingly wrong words actually meant. Li Tianlan naturally couldn't understand, but he didn't think much about it. He reached out and touched Qin Weibai's hair and said softly, "Go take a bath." Qin Weibai nodded obediently. Li Tianlan glanced at Wang Tianzong and said, "Your Majesty, rest early." Then he turned around and left with Qin Weibai and Dongqing Rushi. Wang Tianzong stood outside the door and looked at their backs. Until they disappeared, he slowly turned around and went back to his room. "You're moved." When returning to the room, Qin Weibai's first words revealed Li Tianlan's psychological state very straightforwardly. "For a moment I was indeed moved." Li Tianlan sat on the sofa and sighed. He looked at Qin Weibai and then at Dongqing Rushi. Dongqing Rushi was still pouting. Noticing Li Tianlan's gaze, she wrinkled her nose and said, "I'll run the bath." Qin Weibai looked at Dongqing Rushi's figure with a smile and said softly, "It's normal. You've had a lot of ups and downs tonight. Especially when you were forced to compromise by the Wang family of Beihai, you felt even more frustrated. If I'm not mistaken, before this Wang Tianzong should have given you some pressure, right? Wang Tianzong has always wanted you to enter the Wang family of Beihai. Tonight was a trap he set up. When he talked about this topic with you, your mental state was already not perfect, and he took the initiative to talk about the people and things you care about. In this way there were more flaws. Besides, there was something wrong with the cup of tea you drank. In this way Wang Tianzong could naturally hypnotize you. I just didn't expect Sword Emperor to hypnotize." Li Tianlan laughed at himself. There are also masters in the spiritual field. Wang Tianzong doesn't care about these and he's not proficient in them. If it was Summer Solstice who came tonight, I guess you really can't turn back now. Qin Weibai shook her head. But this state is also very rare for you. Usually even the Pope can't do anything to you, let alone Summer Solstice. Li Tianlan nodded. When he was about to speak, his face suddenly changed. His eyes fell on the coffee table. At this moment there were 3 teacups on the coffee table. One teacup was Li Tianlan's tea. And a glass of juice was Dongqing Rushi's drink. In addition there was a teacup with half a cup of tea in it. Li Tianlan's eyes shifted to Qin Weibai's hand. Qin Weibai held a cup in her hand and quietly drank water. Li Tianlan frowned and suddenly said, "Someone was here just now." Qin Weibai didn't seem surprised. She just said casually, "Who?" Li Tianlan didn't speak. He picked up the remote control in front of him and directly called up the surveillance of the office of the president. There was no surveillance in his room, but there were cameras in every corner of the office of the president. The picture on the screen passed quickly. At a certain moment, the picture suddenly paused for a moment and then continued to play. Then it paused for a moment. Someone must have tampered with the parts that are stuck. Qin Weibai suddenly said. Li Tianlan was silent. He naturally knew this as well. The picture continued to pass. Then Dongqing Rushi walked out of the room and walked to the office of the president. Li Tianlan suddenly paused the picture. On the picture, Dongqing Rushi walked quietly. There was no one around her, but she suddenly nodded. Li Tianlan frowned suddenly. Such a situation could only mean that there was someone around Dongqing Rushi, but he didn't appear in the surveillance. And the person who could do this so perfectly could only be an invincible realm expert. Moreover, he and Wang Tianzong were both in the office of the president, but they didn't find anyone using the power of the invincible realm, which could only mean that this person's control of power had reached the peak. The invincible realm or even the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan frowned. He didn't notice that when he frowned, Qin Weibai, who lowered her head to drink water, had a very sharp light in her eyes. Dongqing Rushi put the bathwater in and walked out. She turned her head and glanced at the screen. Seeing that Li Tianlan was looking through the surveillance video, she was stunned. Her own figure appeared on the screen. She was walking in the direction of the outside of the office of the president. Dongqing Rushi suddenly said, "I didn't get it." "Rushi, did someone come here just now?" Li Tianlan asked. "Yes." Dongqing Rushi nodded. "He said he wanted to talk to you." Li Tianlan had vaguely guessed who it was, but he still asked, "Who?" "The Purgatory of Heaven Capital, deity." Dongqing Rushi said seriously, "He asked me a lot of questions but I didn't tell him." Li Tianlan was silent for a while. For a moment, he didn't know if the missed meeting this time would make him miss other opportunities. Suddenly, the bell rang in the room. The sound of the bell reverberated, lingering in the air. Li Tianlan looked at his watch, then picked up his phone and dialed a number. The phone was quickly connected and a rough voice sounded. "Your Highness?" This was the voice of Li Zhonghu, the commander of the Thunderbolt Division of the Snowdance Corps. Li Tianlan said, Where are they?" 10 minutes to reach the destination." Li Zhonghu opened his mouth and laughed. Li Tianlan grunted and said, "Let's make it quick." He silently put down the phone. His expression was not relaxed but more and more solemn. "Where are they?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. Li Tianlan didn't answer the question. "They'll be here soon, about 10 minutes. Qin Weibai said, Some people set off from here and regarded another point as their destination. The people who went there would arrive at their destination immediately. In this case, the people who set off from another point and regarded this place as their destination would certainly arrive soon." Li Tianlan pressed the screen. He looked at the scene of the block near the Caesar Hotel and was silent for a long time. No one didn't admire Paul's courage. In an absolutely serious situation, surrounded by enemies and with 6 invincible realm experts eyeing him covetously, not everyone dared to ask if they all wanted to die. When he asked this question, his expression was extremely indifferent. The biggest impression that the current patriarch of Rothschild left on the dark world was his gentle and quiet character. But when he really wanted to kill, even King Tong, who was closest to him, could feel that there was an extremely piercing coldness gathering and spreading around him. "Your Highness Paul, we have reason to believe that Rothschild has a close connection with Hell, the largest terrorist organization in Eastern Europe. The men in black have already got the evidence. Not long ago, I received a call from Prime Minister Riker of Wulan State. He asked the men in black to cooperate with Wulan State's action to fight against terrorists. Of course, you have the right to resist, but if there is any misunderstanding, we still hope that you can come back to the office of the President with us." The invincible realm experts and elites of the major forces were getting closer and closer to Paul. In the crowd, Cass Rotter's deep voice suddenly sounded. His tone was calm, but his voice was extremely cold. "As the most loyal servant of God, Rothschild has turned his back on the glory of God in recent years. Your Highness Paul, His Majesty the Pope thinks that it is necessary for you to go back to the European Holy Land with me to explain some of the crimes that you and Rothschild have committed. Otherwise, His Majesty will announce to the world after dawn that Rothschild is the biggest heretic of the Vatican. You and your family will be judged by the Vatican." Mellad walked over with a cold and solemn expression. "His Highness Arcis is already on his way. Your Highness Paul, your resistance is meaningless. On behalf of His Highness Charlemagne, I'll send Rothschild off." In the direction of the Heroes Club, Mitchell's whole body was shrouded in a black cloud, and his voice was gentle. "You can surrender, Your Highnesses. His Highness Li Tianlan is still very hospitable." Qin Shilai's mind gradually calmed down, and he said in a calm tone. Paul looked at the crowd getting closer and closer with cold eyes. His expression was extremely indifferent. All the high-sounding words turned into **T in his ears. His voice was cold and steady. He repeated, "Do you all want to die?" No one spoke. But everyone's heart suddenly froze. Rothschild was one of the oldest forces in the Dark World, but the people in the Dark World only had the impression of King Tong. Paul was the patriarch, but he was also a businessman. No one in the Dark World was familiar with his style, so naturally they did not dare to act rashly. So the scene began to become a stalemate. Time passed slowly in the long stalemate. Paul stared at the invincible realm experts of the major forces calmly, and the killing intent in his eyes grew stronger and stronger. "He's stalling for time." Mellad suddenly said, "Everyone, don't give him a chance." He was a follower and also the second leader of the Holy Disarmament Corps. But in the end he was just himself. The situation tonight was extremely tense and sensitive. Although it seemed that their side had won, Paul's face was calm from beginning to end. No one in the world dared to look down on Rothschild. Similarly, no one dared to look down on the patriarch of Rothschild. In such a situation, Mellad did not want Rothschild to have the slightest possibility of turning the tables. The most correct thing to do was to solve everything as soon as possible. "You're a clown. How can you represent the Vatican?" Paul suddenly sneered. His eyes swept around, and his eyes with killing intent stopped on the invincible realm experts. "Since you all want to die, I'll send you on your way." His figure suddenly took a step forward. Almost at the same time, King Tong, who had been standing beside him and looked very obedient and silent, moved forward at the same time. Two thick shadows suddenly filled the night sky. King Tong's figure was tense, and she opened her domain with all her strength. Unique skill. Shadow Kingdom. Paul's figure strode forward in the Shadow Kingdom, and a thick and obscure light enveloped his whole body. His figure was getting faster and faster, and he directly rushed to the second in command of the Heroes Club, Mitchell, who was the weakest in his perception. Unique skill. Shadow Slaughter. Chapter 501. Every superpower with a long history had its own style. Style was a fixed thing, and it was also the most obvious label. Such a style would often be reflected in all aspects, such as behavior, dressing, temperament, and even martial arts. The unparalleled explosive power of the Wang family of Beihai was their martial arts style. The Li family and the Lin clan's kendo were the fiercest. The Jianghu family of South America's martial arts defense was the best in the world. In close combat, the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican was invincible. Only powerful forces like the Samsara Palace and the Polar Ground Alliance, which had been established for a short time, did not have their own style for the time being. In a sense, this was also a strong evidence of the lack of foundation. The Shadow Throne had not been established for a long time. Countless internal games and struggles had wasted a lot of time. It was not until the last 100 years that the Shadow Throne had really matured. But Rothschild had existed much longer than the establishment of the Shadow Throne. As the strongest and oldest super-wealthy family in the Dark World, Rothschild also had its own martial arts style. Being with the Shadow, Rothschild's martial arts were not lethal, and its defense was not outstanding enough. But it was extremely weird and unpredictable. With Paul's current realm, which was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm, he could be said to be the strongest patriarch in Rothschild in the past few hundred years. No one dared to despise such a figure. This was also the main reason why no one took the lead to take action, although all the superpowers were present. So in the seemingly incompetent but necessary stalemate, Paul, who had already surprised everyone tonight, once again surprised everyone. Several invincible realm experts joined hands. The elites of all the superpowers were present. Outside was the vast army of Wulan State. In such a situation, Paul directly broke the stalemate and took the lead. King Tong, who had been quietly restraining her sharpness beside her brother, suddenly burst out with all her strength the moment Paul took action. The domain formed by the Shadow Kingdom seemed to tear up the surrounding space. Thick gray shadows twisted wildly and rushed over. In the blink of an eye, they had spread to a distance of hundreds of meters. The twisted shadows swept past Paul and enveloped the surroundings. Paul's figure, who was striding forward, flickered for a moment and then disappeared. In an instant, at the forefront of the Heroes Club, Mitchell's hair stood on end. Everyone, ah! Just as his voice rang out, an incomparably shrill scream suddenly rang out behind him. A large amount of liquid splattered behind Mitchell. It was incomparably viscous. The night rain in the air was incomparably cold, but this liquid was so warm, so scarlet and sweet. A vague silhouette appeared behind Mitchell. The moment the outline appeared, the bodies of the two thunder-shocking realm experts of the Heroes Club who were closest to Mitchell suddenly burst into large pieces of flesh and blood. These two people were obviously not the targets of Paul's attack, but two obstacles. In the shadow, his figure was extremely blurry, but he tore the two thunder-shocking realm experts into pieces at an extremely fast speed. His speed didn't slow down at all, and he directly stepped into Mitchell's domain. Invincible realm? Paul suddenly spoke, seemingly a little surprised. Mitchell was not famous in the Heroes Club. He could only be considered an ordinary member of the upper echelon. The only thing that made him different was that he was the closest to President Charlemagne. However, according to the secret intelligence of the major forces, Mitchell should only have the combat capability of the Invincible Realm and had not really broken through to the Invincible Realm. In theory, the combat capability of the Invincible Realm could be said to be the top expert of the half-step Invincible Realm. But the moment Paul stepped into Mitchell's domain, he found that it was not the kind of pseudo-domain that was infinitely close to the real domain. It was the real domain of the Invincible Realm. Obviously, Mitchell had completely broken through the natural moat and become a real expert of the Invincible Realm. No wonder, Paul muttered to himself and moved forward again. Mitchell's domain was completely useless. At this moment, Mitchell used his strongest unique skill, but he couldn't stop Paul at all. When he took the third step, the domain around Mitchell completely collapsed in an instant. The vague silhouette of Paul disappeared from his sight. But a huge and deadly danger suddenly came from all directions. Mitchell rushed forward completely out of instinct. His body rushed out at least 20 meters and he even rolled on the ground in embarrassment. But before he could stand up, in a shrill scream, a large amount of blood rain flew up. In the shadow, Paul's figure was vague and sharp. All the experts of the Heroes Club standing between him and Mitchell, no matter what realm they were in, turned into a rain of blood in the blink of an eye. Before Mitchell could catch his breath, Paul, who was almost completely invisible, had appeared in front of him again. Almost no one in the dark world had seen Paul's real attack. Occasionally, some people were lucky enough to see it, but they all died silently. So no one had seen the shadow slaughter. To some extent, this was the first appearance of the shadow slaughter in the dark world. Any unique skill that could be famous in the dark world seemed to need to be stained with blood when it appeared for the first time. Paul's figure flashed to Mitchell's side. His palm was slightly bent, like a sharp claw that could tear everything. The moment his arm cut through the air, there was a harsh sonic boom. The air was torn apart. When the sound came from behind, Paul's claw-like palm had directly appeared above Mitchell's head. Bang! There was a dull sound, but there was no blood. An incomparably thick black shadow suddenly appeared under Paul's claws. The black shadow squirmed and expanded, directly enveloping Mitchell. Paul's claws rubbed against the black shadow, making a dull sound, and even bringing up a dazzling spark. Paul's eyes narrowed. Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, appeared beside Mitchell. When Paul narrowed his eyes, he picked up the Dark Saint spear that covered Mitchell. The Dark Saint spear, which was famous in the dark world, had completely turned into a mass of liquid that could change constantly during the charging period. As Raphael raised his palm, the shield-shaped Dark Saint spear changed crazily and finally turned into a huge hammer that was 2 kilometers long. Raphael waved the hammer in his hand. Without any nonsense, he smashed the hammer directly at Paul's head. Paul sneered and took a step back. His figure flashed. But the shadow and the pure light lit up at the same time. The unique skill of the Vatican. The light was boundless. In the shadow, countless pure beams of light floated up in an instant. The dense beams of light continued to expand in the shadow, dispersing the shadow. Paul's figure appeared clearly in everyone's sight. Mellad strode forward without hesitation. His eyes were full of seriousness. This was the first time that the shadow slaughter had appeared in the dark world. However, he could clearly see the absolute destructive power of this unique skill. Rothschild and the Vatican were mortal enemies. To some extent, Paul's shadow slaughter was aimed at Arcis. Arcis was very strong. As one of the few experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world, Arcis was best at close combat. In other words, the martial arts of the Vatican were best at close combat. In a one-on-one close combat, Arcis was not even afraid of Wang Tianzong without listen to the sea. It was no exaggeration to say that Arcis was now the strongest person in close combat in the entire dark world. In the entire dark world, there might be only one unique skill that could compete with Arcis in close combat without falling into a disadvantageous position. Dragon Fist. The Dragon Fist of the Lin clan and the Li family. Only the Dragon Fist. But the Dragon Fist was the unique skill of the invincible manual in the map of God of War. For hundreds of years, except for the ancestors of the Lin clan, none of the invincible realm experts of the Lin clan and the Li family had practiced the invincible manual. Although there was Li Tianlan now, Li Tianlan was far from growing up. Therefore, in this field, Arcis was still the strongest, second to none. At this moment, Paul's shadow slaughter was also extremely strange, and it was also a close combat. After being crowned by the Pope, Mellad was already in the invincible realm, and his real strength was close to the peak of the invincible realm. He was not much weaker than Paul. He could be said to be one of the people with the highest realm in the field, so he could naturally see how terrifying this shadow slaughter was. In terms of lethality and ferocity, Paul's shadow slaughter was far inferior to Arcis's. But this unique skill was too fast, extremely strange, and the angle was tricky. In close combat, this kind of unique skill could be said to be the best unique skill for the weak to defeat the strong. Therefore, Mellad could only choose to make a move. If he didn't make a move at this time, Paul's shadow slaughter had the possibility of defeating several invincible realm experts present one by one. Even Arcis might be seriously injured. In this state, Paul had not yet reached the peak of the invincible realm. But with this unique skill, his lethality had firmly reached that field. Mellad naturally didn't care about Arcis's life or death, but it was also His Majesty's plan to destroy Rothschild. How could he delay it? Therefore, in the chaos of Eastern Europe, on the battlefield of the invincible realm, facing Paul, who was at the peak of the invincible realm, The first to make a move and join hands were the sworn enemies of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican and the commander of the Dark Knights. The light of countless scenes expanded wildly. Melit's sudden attack directly showed all the strength he could show at this time in his realm. Countless huge pillars of light suddenly exploded after expanding to the limit. The light scattered and fell like rain. The pure and broken light almost completely illuminated the night sky. Countless rays of light seemed to become a piece of pure water that kept fluctuating. Under the light, Paul's figure became clearer than ever. The huge black hammer in Raphael's hand fell to the ground, and the long street suddenly shook. The dense cracks on the street spread in all directions. The huge force shattered the shops on both sides of the road. Smoke and dust also fell to the ground with broken glass. There was a loud roar. Raphael was expressionless. He held the hammer in his hand tightly and suddenly waved it. The hammer cut through the air and made an extremely loud and dull sound. The dark saint's spear suddenly changed in the air. It turned into a huge black long saber. Raphael held the long saber in his hand and rushed directly to Paul. After a moment of hesitation, everyone made a move at the same time. There was no nonsense. Cass Rotter, Huan Kong, Qin Shilai, and Mitchell all rushed to Paul without hesitation. Since the beginning of the chaos in Eastern Europe tonight, this was the first time that many Invincible Realm experts had besieged one person at the same time. The battlefield that only belonged to the Invincible Realm had completely opened in the violent battle. Chapter 502. Shadows and light were entangled crazily in the night sky. In different directions, countless rays of light burst out completely. The dark saint's spear had become a huge broad-edged long saber. The blade was 3 meters long, but when Raphael waved it, the black saber light, which was hundreds of meters long, seemed to tear the world apart. Melad had become completely serious. Bright and pure rays of light flew wildly around his body and gradually turned into a light curtain. The light curtain continued to spread in the shadows. Melad's entire body tensed up in an instant. In the large expanse of pure light, he directly rushed towards Paul. Cass Rotter was also moving. Among all the people present, Cass Rotter was the strongest Invincible Realm expert other than Paul on the surface, so his speed was naturally the fastest. The moment the dark saber light of the Dark Saint's spear fell, Cass Rotter's figure had already appeared directly in front of Paul. He punched. Powerful thunderbolt. In an instant, a sea of thunder appeared in the air. The vast and majestic thunderbolts fell down densely and smashed the space. The night sky was constantly distorted by the raging thunderbolts. The blue thunderbolts were refracted into colorful light by the distorted space. Cass Rotter's eyes were focused and solemn. Without any probing, he went all out the moment he made up his mind to make a move. He was the god of war of Star State. To some extent, he could even be said to be the god of war of North America. Cass Rotter's own growth trajectory was legendary. Star State and North America also had martial arts forces with a long history. But Cass Rotter did not come from any martial arts force. He was the most traditional soldier in Star State. His parents died when he was a child. When he was 8 years old, he was taken to a secret military base in Star State to receive training. At the age of 12, he entered the special warfare system of Star State. Now he was 52 years old and had fought for Star State for 40 years. From the most junior soldier to the brigadier general, and then to the general, until he became the god of war today, Cass Rotter's strength was completely forged in countless life and death battles. He did not have any martial arts philosophy, so naturally he did not have any martial arts style. But in other words, he was already very familiar with any fighting style, and it could even be said to be his style. This was an expert of the Invincible Realm who didn't rely on any external force and completely relied on himself. Cass Rotter was able to reach the peak of the Invincible Realm today. Both his perseverance and talent were shocking. All the Invincible Realm experts in the world, including Wang Tianzong Deity and Arsis, who were at the peak of the Invincible Realm, were probably not as experienced as Cass Rotter in actual combat. Paul's realm was higher than Cass Rotter's, but in front of this kind of Invincible Realm expert who had killed his way out, realms sometimes didn't mean everything, especially when their realms were similar. Therefore, Paul did not hesitate to dodge Cass Rotter's attack. In midair, the two of them hurriedly exchanged punches. A surging sea of lightning erupted wildly. With the help of Cass Rotter's punch, Paul instantly retreated hundreds of meters. However, before he could stabilize his body, the Dark Saint Spear's blade slashed at him from behind again. Cass Rotter roared almost crazily as he rushed past the fading shadows and approached them. The bright sword light flashed in a white arc high up in the sky. Boundless sharpness gathered in one place. Qin Shilai was high in the sky. His body suddenly turned upside down, head down and feet up, and he stabbed down with his sword. The earth split. The man and the sword became one. The sharpness and Qin Shilai merged together, as if they were completely burning. In the deep night sky, the shadow of a long sword that was hundreds of meters long but extremely slender and dangerous suddenly appeared. With extreme penetrating power and killing intent, the shadow directly locked Paul in the night sky. The extremely solid ground below suddenly turned into a vast ocean. The torrent of power that was enough to destroy everything suddenly rose. Huan Kong and Mitchell made a move at the same time. Their power gathered together without hesitation and attacked Paul from a distance. Cass Rotter appeared near Paul once again. The thunderbolts that kept spreading around him stopped for a moment, and then disappeared completely. Or rather, they didn't disappear. Instead, all the thunderbolts restrained their light. The sharpness in the sky was above. The torrent of power was below. The invisible thunderbolts filled the surrounding world in an instant, turning it into an extremely solidified domain. A unique skill. In the world of thunder. An obvious and clear sense of numbness filled Paul's whole body. His extremely agile and strange figure instantly slowed down a lot. The torrent surged. The sharpness was unparalleled. The black saber light split the sky. The pure light and the thunderbolts entangled with each other. All the power in the air gathered in one place. The space kept twisting and exploding, illuminating the whole world with colorful colors. Ah! An extremely high-pitched and sharp scream suddenly sounded. The voice was so sharp and loud that some of the soldiers of Wulan State who were closest to King Tong directly covered their ears and fell down. King Tong kept screaming. She was shrill, furious, and full of killing intent. As she screamed, she slowly squatted down with her arms around her shoulders. Such an action made her look like an ordinary girl who had been wronged but was extremely helpless. But before anyone had time to pity her, a shadow that was several times thicker than before suddenly burst out. The shadow was the domain. The shadow was several times thicker than before, which meant that King Tong's domain was several times thicker than before. She broke through. On the battlefield of the invincible realm, surrounded by a group of enemies, under great pressure, King Tong, who was already close to breaking through, took a step closer at the most critical moment. And it was a big step. On the road far ahead, the peak of the invincible realm was already in sight. On the road far behind, the invincible realm, which had been stabilized, became a little blurred. The thick shadow continued to spread, one after another, like layers of ripples shaking endlessly. The pure light around Mellad was suppressed in the blink of an eye. The gray shadow spread in the distance and rushed into the dark world. Under the influence of King Tong's domain, Paul's actions suddenly became extremely agile. He rarely fought in his life, but it didn't mean that he didn't study martial arts in his daily life. As a super expert who had quietly approached the peak of the invincible realm, the shadow slaughter could be said to be the highest achievement in his life. But this unique skill was not perfect. At present, the biggest shortcoming was that when he used the shadow slaughter, his domain and this unique skill were not perfectly combined. In other words, the shadow slaughter was his strongest attack state, and when he was in his strongest state, his domain was the weakest. If he could perfectly combine his domain with the shadow slaughter, he would go further and become a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm. This step was very close for Paul, but it was also very far. At least it was impossible tonight. But tonight he had King Tong by his side. And it was King Tong who had made a breakthrough. King Tong's domain could completely make up for the weakness in his domain. Now King Tong had made another breakthrough, and her domain had been strengthened. Coupled with Paul's existing domain, the two of them worked together, and Paul's last weakness had completely disappeared. What did this mean? The shadow slaughter was perfect. Now Paul's domain was also perfect. In King Tong's domain, Paul was no longer infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. He was at the peak of the invincible realm. Paul suddenly laughed. His laughter was very soft, but it was incomparably cold and arrogant. It carried with it an extremely clear sense of contempt. The peak of the invincible realm was the god of the dark world. There were not only ordinary experts in the dark world, but also some ordinary invincible realm experts who had not reached the peak of the invincible realm. Paul's laughter became more and more arrogant. King Tong's incomparably dense and solidified domain spread over layer by layer, and an obscure vortex appeared on the ground. Under the scouring of King Tong's domain, the torrent of power of Huan Kong and Mitchell also became much more illusory. A faintly discernible but incomparably cold sense of danger rose in the hearts of everyone around them. High in the sky, the sharp sword light became more and more dazzling. Paul raised his head and glanced at Qin Shilai, with undisguised killing intent in his eyes. Qin Shilai suddenly gritted his teeth. The sword light flowed, but the momentum suddenly changed. The remaining power of the earth-splitting move was still there, but the sword light had changed perfectly once, and its momentum was even stronger than before. Earth-destroying move. Paul stretched out his palm. The thick shadow and the dazzling sword light instantly intersected. A gray wave visible to the naked eye completely burst out at the intersection of Paul's palm and the blade of the sharp sword. Kasradar's body suddenly shook. The world of thunder that imprisoned Paul was on the verge of collapse. The dark saber light of the dark saint's spear was completely shattered. In the close distance of the entanglement of light and darkness, Paul firmly pinched the blade of the sharp sword with one hand. Qin Shilai gritted his teeth and tried his best to stab with the sword. "It's useless." Paul's voice was soft and piercingly cold. "Since you all want to die, then go to hell." Bang! The incomparably crisp sound of breaking suddenly resounded through the night sky. The sword energy, which had been condensed to the extreme, completely exploded and scattered in disorder. Paul's face was expressionless. With one hand he directly broke the famous sword, the sharp edge, which was famous in the dark world. Qin Shilai's face instantly turned pale. The sword energy surged uncontrollably in all directions. The corner of his mouth moved, and he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. Mellad, whose expression changed dramatically, suddenly roared, "The Gate of Hope." The Gate of Hope was not his unique skill. But it was the unique skill of the Vatican. As his voice fell, the team of the Vatican Saint warriors suddenly lit up with a large amount of light. The light was like a waterfall, surging up wildly. At the same time, the attacks of the Invincible Realm experts came roaring again. Paul's figure suddenly flickered. The next second, everyone's attacks were completely defeated by his tough counterattack. His figure reappeared in everyone's line of sight, empty-handed. Qin Shilai, who had escaped, looked at the sharp edge in his hand that had been broken, and then at Paul's empty hands. His expression changed dramatically. Suddenly, a panic-stricken and heavy breathing sound rang out in the silent atmosphere. A few people turned their heads subconsciously. In their sight, Mitchell, who was the weakest but also a genuine Invincible Realm expert, stiffened on the spot. His eyes were fixed on Paul. A section of the blade had pierced into his abdomen, but there was no blood. "Charlemagne will accompany you soon," Paul said calmly. "You," Mitchell raised his hands with difficulty, but as soon as he said a word, his body suddenly swelled. Bang! There was another dull thud. The body of Mitchell, the second in command of the Heroes Club and an Invincible Realm expert, suddenly exploded and turned into flesh and blood flying all over the sky. Chapter 503. The whole battlefield fell completely silent in an instant. Among the saint warriors of the Vatican, the pure light that had just risen suddenly dissipated. In the brief silence, almost everyone's faces were blank. Even several Invincible Realm experts didn't know what had happened. They were Invincible Realm experts. They were the figures standing at the peak of the Dark World. The chaos in Eastern Europe was surging, and the general trend was mighty. It was not that no one had thought that an Invincible Realm expert would die, but no one had thought that the Invincible Realm expert would die so easily. In a few minutes, light and darkness alternated, and then there was a rain of blood. The sacrifice of thousands of soldiers in Wulan state was not as impactful as the death of Mitchell. The rain of blood that suddenly exploded in the night was like a basin of seawater that had been fished out from under the glacier of the Arctic Ocean. It splashed on several Invincible Realm experts with an incomparably piercing coldness. Paul stood in the encirclement of several Invincible Realm experts, and his expression was still calm and gentle. But the move of Shadow Slaughter just now had cut off the sharpness and killed the Invincible Realm experts. It was only for a moment, but it had already shown the absolute strength of the Patriarch of Rothschild. Paul's eyes moved from Kasrader to Raphael, Qin Shilai, Huan Kong and Mellad. He suddenly chuckled and said, "Who else wants to die?" His voice was gentle and calm, but there was undisguised arrogance in his words. A strong sense of humiliation rushed directly to the heads of several Invincible Realm experts. Kasrader took a step forward. His footsteps were getting faster and faster. He took big steps and then he began to charge with all his might. A large amount of blue light flowed out of his body. At this moment, even Kasrader's eyes turned blue. The martial arts of this star-state god of war had no trace of martial arts power. He entered the thunder-shocking realm at the age of 27 and reached the peak of the thunder-shocking realm at the age of 29. But when he broke through from the thunder-shocking realm to the invincible realm, he was already close to 50 years old. Nearly 20 years of life in the thunder-shocking realm had made him accustomed to it. Even if he broke through to the invincible realm, his attacks were still filled with thousands of thunderbolts. Even his invincible domain was thunderbolts. Endless thunderbolts bloomed and spread on Cass Rotter's body, then contracted and condensed. The thunderbolts kept changing and finally condensed into a light shadow similar to armor. The silhouette of Cass Rotter's armor surrounded him from head to toe, making him appear incomparably majestic. This set of armor was Cass Rotter's domain, and also his most powerful technique. Thunder God Possession. Gate of Hope. Melad's roar sounded again. Hundreds of saint warriors glowed with pure light at the same time. King Tong was still squatting on the ground. However, her body became more and more tense, and the domain that was slowly spreading out with her as the core suddenly became more turbulent. The speed of the gray ripples began to increase, and the color had almost turned black. Most of the pure light formed by hundreds of saint warriors was washed away by the domain of King Tong, but a small amount of light barely broke through the shadow and fell on several invincible realm experts. The light flowed on the bodies of the invincible realm experts, and the night sky within a few meters suddenly turned into day. Melad suddenly frowned. This result was far too different from what he had expected. The Gate of Hope could be said to be one of the strongest unique skills in the Vatican's defense system. It could even be said to be the unique skill that best restrained the Dark Shadow royal family. If King Tong hadn't made a breakthrough, hundreds of saint warriors would have launched the Gate of Hope at the same time, which would have completely dispelled King Tong's domain. At that time, the light on the bodies of the invincible realm experts would have been completely connected. Within a kilometer, no matter how strong Paul was, he wouldn't have been able to hide his figure. However, King Tong's breakthrough had condensed her domain several times. Now, when the light of the Gate of Hope came, it was difficult for it to spread to a distance of 10 meters from several invincible realm experts, not to mention a piece of it. 10 meters was not a distance at all. Paul would show up within 10 meters, but at most he could only give a few invincible realm experts some time to react. Kill Kong Tong. The huge black saber in Raphael's hand slashed at King Tong. The sharp black knife light appeared in front of King Tong almost in an instant. This slash was like a signal. The Dark Knights, Fantasy World, the Vatican, the Men in Black, and even the Heroes Club and all the soldiers around Wulon State rushed to King Tong. Paul is very strong. But in the current situation only King Tong is the key. The solidification of King Tong's domain after the breakthrough perfectly made up for Paul's shortcomings. But where King Tong's domain spread, Paul's strength was almost no weaker than that of any expert at the peak of the invincible realm. He was invincible at the peak of the invincible realm. So he could only kill King Tong first. King Tong was motionless. At this moment she completely gave up all the unique skills and means of attack. All her strength and will were unprecedentedly focused. The gray domain, which was close to darkness, shook and spread out layer by layer. For a moment, the light on the bodies of several invincible realm experts had been suppressed to the lowest point. The whole situation suddenly became extremely chaotic. For both sides, time was everything. After the breakthrough, King Tong was very strong. However, there was more than one expert of the half-step invincible realm in the teams of the Dark Knights, the Vatican, the Fantasy World, and the Men in Black. Several experts of the half-step invincible realm, dozens of experts at the peak of the thundershocking realm, and more experts of the thundershocking realm besieged King Tong's domain at the same time. King Tong could not hold on for too long. But the problem was that if King Tong's domain was not broken, the several invincible realm experts could not hold on for too long. In this state there was no way out for both sides. They could only hold on. King Tong placed her hopes on Paul. Several invincible realm experts, on the other hand, placed their hopes on the people who besieged King Tong. Kill, kill, kill. Raphael's eyes suddenly turned scarlet. The blade of the Dark Saint spear shrank, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into an extremely slender and sharp black long saber that was less than 2 meters long. Raphael's momentum suddenly changed and he went completely mad. He rushed through the night with the light on his body, like a meteor in the night sky, and appeared beside Paul in an instant. Darkness went berserk. The almost crazy killing intent was mighty in the blade of the Dark Saint spear. The night sky was torn apart by the saber light, and countless shadows were chopped into pieces by Raphael's saber. Cass Rotter, who was possessed by the Thunder God, also attacked with all his strength. Crazy thunder. Crazy saber. Qin Shilai clenched the broken sword in his hand and rushed up again without hesitation. An extremely ferocious scarlet dagger appeared in Paul's hand. The dagger was extremely long, and it could even be said to be a short saber. Countless thunderbolts and saber lights surged around him. Paul held the dagger, and the moment the shadows around him surged, he took a step back and disappeared in an instant. Be careful. Cass Rotter and Raphael warned at the same time. Clang. The crisp sound of weapons clashing suddenly rang out. Before Cass Rotter and Raphael's voices had died away, Paul's body had already appeared directly in front of Huan Kong, the lord of the fantasy world. The scarlet dagger, like a red bolt of lightning, fell in an instant and smashed hard on the dagger in Huan Kong's hand. Sparks flew everywhere. The dagger in Huan Kong's hand broke into two pieces without any suspense. Under the tremendous force, Huan Kong, who was bleeding from the corner of his mouth, was directly smashed to the ground. The instant the two of them fought, the shattered space kept spreading as he fell. Some of the elites who were besieging King Tong were directly swallowed up. Huan Kong fell to the ground and vomited a lot of blood. He couldn't stand up for a while. Paul's face was slightly pale, but he didn't slow down his movements at all. The moment King Tong's domain spread out again, his figure flashed for a moment and directly appeared in front of Mellad. It was not until this time that Raphael's somewhat gloomy voice suddenly sounded. Ghost Hand. Ghost Hand, the legendary European saber. The sharpest weapon of Rothschild. Among the 12 murderous weapons, the indefinite grace was almost as famous as the human emperor. And the famous saber, Ghost Hand, could also be as famous as the listen to the sea sword of the Wang family of Beihai. Its sharpness was unparalleled. Mellad retreated backward completely out of condition reflex. But in the next moment, Paul directly appeared behind Mellad, and his arms wrapped around Mellad's neck. Ghost Hand cuts throat. In the domain of King Tong, Paul could almost be said to be the most flexible invincible realm expert in the dark world today. His defense and attack were very ordinary, but his body movement, which could be studied based on the domain, was extremely strange and unfathomable. Under such circumstances, Mellad's expression changed drastically. He blocked Paul's palm and suddenly exerted his strength. The void surged layer by layer, and the domains on their bodies collided fiercely. Mellad let out a muffled groan and forcibly broke free from Paul's dagger. Paul's attack missed, so he condensed his body again and appeared not far away. There was a bloody hole in Mellad's neck. Although the wound was not deep, the blood flowing out was shocking. Mellad slowly touched his wound and looked at Paul. An incomparably violent murderous aura suddenly flashed across his eyes. Paul was also staring at Mellad. His eyes were extremely deep. His mistake just now was normal, but it was also abnormal. His strength was just right. If Mellad was really at the level of an ordinary invincible realm expert, it was basically impossible for him to resist his all-out surprise attack. But in fact, Mellad had really resisted it. The exchange of blows just now was too fast and it gave Paul a very vague feeling. But in that short period of time he clearly sensed the danger that Mellad was in. Moreover, the unique skill that Mellad had used to break free from his dagger just now was not a technique of the Vatican. Did this vice-commander of the Vatican's Holy Disarmament Corps hide his strength? Or did he have another identity? There was a flash of playfulness in Paul's eyes. He looked around at the several invincible realm experts around him, as if he was looking for a target and waiting for an opportunity to make a move. Every invincible realm expert was tense, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Paul was definitely the most troublesome opponent. His attack was not strong and his defense was not strong, but he was extremely flexible. In terms of attack, he was even slightly inferior to Cass Rotter. But no matter how strong Cass Rotter was, what was the use of all his attacks if they couldn't hit Paul? Paul spoke slowly. However, as soon as his voice sounded, a louder voice had already come from below. An incomparably huge saber shadow swept across the block that was hundreds of meters long below in an instant. The crazy saber light shattered everything. The streets and buildings were shattered under the saber light. The first to bear the brunt were the elites who had besieged King Tong. The saber light flashed away, but the blood all over the sky flew wildly. Under this saber strike, countless elites of the Vatican, the Dark Knights, the fantasy world, and the men in black had fallen in the camps of all the forces. Paul suddenly burst out laughing. Cass Rotter and Raphael's eyes turned red in an instant. Chapter 504. There was no sign of the huge change. It was completely sudden, but when the saber light lit up, it was incomparably tyrannical. Layers of saber light soared into the sky, sweeping through the crowd without the slightest leeway. It was hair-raising and blood splattered everywhere. At the most critical and subtle time, the appearance of this saber almost completely changed the situation in the field. And this saber was not the end, but just the beginning. The confusion after a large number of lives withered still remained in everyone's heart. An extremely shrill howl sounded again. Before the blood and corpses in the air fell to the ground, the seemingly endless saber light on the ground bloomed crazily again. An extremely high-pitched, sharp, and extremely crazy scream resounded through the night sky along with the saber light. In the camp of the men in black, a high-level expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm was about to signal his people to gather, but the absolutely presumptuous saber light had already rushed in front of him. The saber light smashed the thunder and pierced the internal organs of the man. With a loud bang, the high-level expert of the men in black, who was famous in the dark world of North America, had been smashed into minced meat. The crazy saber light cut directly into the camp of the men in black and whistled. Wherever the saber light passed, the high-level experts and elites of the major forces were all chopped into pieces, and their blood shot high into the sky. But they did not fall under the saber light all over the sky. Instead, they were swept into the sky along with the saber light. Looking down from above, the crazy saber light raised a scarlet storm with a lot of minced meat and internal organs, cruel and tyrannical. There were many casualties. The pressure on King Tong's body suddenly lightened, and her expression completely relaxed. Countless shadows completely enveloped the entire battlefield nearby. The shadows suppressed all the elites of the major forces and merged with the saber light. The saber light rushed and killed in the crowd, and flesh and blood flew everywhere. It seemed to be more and more like a fish in water. King Tong raised her head and looked at the several invincible realm experts in the air. The corners of her mouth rose slightly, but there was undisguised killing intent and anger in her eyes. Ah! The scream that almost pierced people's eardrums rang out again. The bloody storm that was spinning crazily in the shadow suddenly came to a halt. In the next second, the cruel and cold saber light instantly expanded to hundreds of meters, and the huge saber phantom that was hundreds of meters long rotated for a moment in an extremely light manner. A violent roar suddenly rang out. The area within a radius of several hundred meters completely exploded. The ground, the buildings, the shops, the street lamps, the cars on both sides of the road, everything was chopped into powder by this slash. In the camp of the major forces, the extremely bright lightning built one defensive wall after another. But when the saber light swept over, the defensive wall condensed by lightning was directly smashed without any suspense. Bright electric arcs danced everywhere. The saber light and the lightning spread to the army of Wulan State at the same time. A large number of soldiers were smashed by the saber light and the lightning at the same time, and died without a whole corpse. Blood flowed like a river. Everything happened in an instant. The saber light crisscrossed and it was a real disaster. Violet. Raphael's furious voice covered the night sky, like the roar of a god. You're courting death. Mayor Morden's Violet. He was an invincible realm expert of the Violet family, one of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe. She was not the clan leader. She was the wife of the patriarch of the Violet family. Raphael subconsciously glanced at Qin Shilai. Out of trust in Li Tianlan, he did not ask about Li Tianlan's entire plan. But he still knew that the Qin clan in Eastern Europe would join hands with Rekvia to stop the Violet and Morton families. But now Violet had appeared here. Where were the people of the Qin clan and the Rekvia family? In Raphael's sight, Qin Shilai's expression was still as calm as before. The Qin clan and the Rekvia family were indeed going to stop Violet and Morton. But not now. The bloody storm on the ground finally began to dissipate slowly. But wherever the saber light passed just now, it rolled up the blood and internal organs of countless elites and rushed up to a height of hundreds of meters. Now as the storm dissipated, the blood and rain all over the sky fell at the same time. The scene looked strange and evil. A somewhat short woman appeared in front of King Tong. She was only 1.6 meters tall at most. Among Europeans she was indeed a mini pocket-sized, but her figure was extremely hot. Her silver hair was scattered on her shoulders. This invincible realm woman, whose strength was not as good as Qin Shilai's, was far more famous in Eastern Europe. She was smiling casually, and her smile was seductive and presumptuous. The blood rain kept falling. Violet casually sucked the blood on her hand that belonged to someone. In Raphael's loud roar, she chuckled softly. How dare you come to Eastern Europe? You're all going to die tonight, all of you. There was silence in the sky. Even Raphael fell silent. Women had never been weak in the dark world. On the divine list, the master of Samsara Palace, Situt Sanyue, King Tong was shining brightly. On the holy list there were also experts like Violet. Violet's ranking on the holy list was second only to Huan Kong, the dominator of fantasy world. She might not be a match for any invincible realm expert present, but her arrival was enough to break the extremely fragile balance in the field. The battle before Violet's arrival was fierce and deadlocked. If the elites of the major forces could break through King Tong's defense line and prevent her domain from supporting Paul, Paul would definitely die. If Paul could kill one or two invincible realm experts in King Tong's domain, he and King Tong could also break through successfully. Now that Violet was here, it not only meant that under her protection King Tong's domain was unbreakable, but it also meant that the elites of the major forces on the ground were also in danger under Violet's butcher knife. If King Tong's domain was not broken, Paul would be at the peak of the invincible realm. It was only a matter of time before he defeated them. Unless they could have at least one more invincible realm expert who could restrain Violet. Cass Rotter suddenly glanced at Qin Shilai. Mellad was also looking at Qin Shilai. Cass Rotter quickly looked away. However, Mellad remained calm and collected. At the very least, he knew that there could be at least one more invincible realm expert on Li Tianlan's side. No matter whether that invincible realm expert was the master of Samsara Palace or not, he definitely belonged to Samsara Palace. Qin Shilai, Raphael, and that invincible realm expert were the normal lineup on Li Tianlan's side. Dear? Mellad narrowed his eyes. Just as he was about to speak, the night sky in the distance suddenly twisted. An incomparably huge domain was roaring and surging in the night sky. The domain continued to expand and became more and more obvious. In the end, it turned into a huge vortex that seemed to devour the whole sky. A blazing white light suddenly lit up in the center of the vortex. The light was like lightning. In an instant, it traversed the night sky. Almost in the blink of an eye, it had arrived behind Cass Rotter. Caught off guard, Cass Rotter instinctively crossed his hands, and lightning burst out in front of him. But the blazing white light tore the night sky with a strong impact. In an instant, it pushed Cass Rotter nearly 100 meters away. The distance of 100 meters was not long, but there was an irreparable gap in the formation of several invincible realm experts besieging Paul. The light of hell. It's hostile. Be careful. Mellet's hoarse voice suddenly rang out. Everyone hoped that there could be another invincible realm expert in the field. So the invincible realm expert really came. And he was the top expert in Eastern Europe after Tyrant disappeared. But damn it, he was an invincible realm expert who was standing opposite several invincible realm experts. He was Patriarch Hastile, who was ranked 14th on the divine list and one of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church. The light of heaven was Hastile's signature unique skill. But in the eyes of the Vatican, the people of the Eastern Church were all heretics. The light of heaven naturally became the light of hell. The opportunity appeared in an instant. But for Paul, it was a long-awaited opportunity. The moment Cass Rotter was pushed away by the light of heaven, Paul's whole body suddenly tightened. He shouted, "King Tong." When Violet appeared, King Tong, who had been prepared, tensed her body to the limit. As soon as Paul opened his mouth, the Queen of the Shadow Throne suddenly opened her hands. A mouthful of blood flowed directly from the corner of her mouth as she burst out with all her strength. King Tong's hands became tighter and tighter. The thick shadow surged like a tide, becoming unprecedentedly crazy. The shadow was like a tide. Paul took a step into the shadow. Shadow slaughter. Without any reservation at this moment he was truly at the peak of the invincible realm in King Tong's domain. He had the strongest speed and the fastest attack. His figure flickered and disappeared in an instant. The shadow of death suddenly enveloped every invincible realm expert. No one could see Paul's figure. But the next moment, an extremely dull sound suddenly rang out in the sky. Bang! It was like a broken balloon. The dull sound was very low, but it was so shocking. A ball of blood-colored light directly exploded in the air. The powerful domain expanded and shrank with the death of its master. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Cass Rotter, who had rushed back to the battlefield at full speed against the light of heaven, suddenly became extremely cold. Qin Shilai, Mellad, and Raphael all looked stupefied. That piece of flesh and blood had been completely blown apart. But everyone knew who the person in that position should be. Fantasy world in North America. Huan Kong, an invincible realm expert. He had just been smashed to the ground by Paul. Now that he had just rushed back to the battlefield, Paul, who had burst out without reservation, had already appeared in front of him. He was killed with one blow. Tonight, the second invincible realm expert died. Before anyone had time to sigh with emotion about the fate of fantasy world in the future, Paul's figure had disappeared again. An extremely scarlet light suddenly appeared in the eyes of the Dark Sword Master of Eastern Europe. The night sky was so vast. The shadow was infinite. The red light suddenly expanded in the blink of an eye. The red light was strange. Paul's incomparably cold eyes appeared in front of his eyes. Ghost Hand, the famous saber. The scarlet blade of the Ghost Hand was raised, and the extreme power brought the blade down suddenly. At this moment, the sharpness of the Ghost Hand had surpassed Qin Shilai's thinking. Qin Shilai subconsciously raised the blade, but the speed at which he raised the sword suddenly became extremely slow. The blade of the Ghost Hand moved from top to bottom, as if it was going to cut his body into pieces. Qin Shilai blinked. The blade fell in an instant. An incomparably huge force suddenly came from behind. On the edge of the fall, a palm suddenly grabbed Qin Shilai's body and pulled him back dozens of meters. The blade chopped down fiercely, but it was only a shadow that was broken. Paul was stunned and looked up silently. In his sight, an extremely thin figure appeared behind Qin Shilai. He was dressed in black. A silver mask. It was cold and awe-inspiring. Chapter 505. Paul frowned and suddenly felt a little uneasy. The person who could suddenly make a move on the battlefield of the Invincible Realm and save Qin Shilai at the critical moment was undoubtedly in the Invincible Realm. But in Paul's perception, the other party's state was extremely strange, or in other words, his realm was very chaotic. His realm seemed to have just entered the Invincible Realm and could not be stabilized. But even Paul was amazed by the speed that broke out in an instant. His own defense and attack were not excellent. In the shadow domain, his strongest point was the strange attack that was impossible to guard against. To put it bluntly, this kind of martial arts style was actually a real assassin. Paul was the patriarch of Rothschild, not an assassin. But his style had already been determined. The upper and lower limits of the top assassins were infinite. Similarly, the top assassins often did not pay much attention to the strength on paper in the battle. Most of the examples of the weak defeating the strong in the dark world were created by the assassins. To some extent, the assassins who were flexible and strange and could kill with one blow were the easiest people to create miracles. Paul could be said to be at the peak in this field. So he was not afraid of Arceus, whose strength was stronger than his on paper. In the domain of King Tong he was even more confident. But the most troublesome thing for him was to face the top assassins in the dark world. Who was the strongest assassin in the dark world? This question might have been controversial more than 3 years ago, but with the death of Jiang Chenxia of the Jiang family of South America in the final battle of Heaven Capital, all the controversies no longer existed. In this era, there was only one strongest assassin, and he was also the only assassin of the Invincible Realm in the Dark World. Sai City, Zhongzhou State. Tribulation. Paul stared at the silver mask in front of him. All his emotions were restrained and he became serious and serious. Lord of Shadow? Paul asked softly with an indescribable emotion in his tone. Thank you, Your Highness. Qin Shilai, who was shocked and stable, took a deep breath, but his face was still a little pale. The moment just now was very short, but it was the closest he had ever been to death in his life. The feeling of brushing past death could be said to be unforgettable, so his thanks were also very sincere. I owe you a life. Tribulation shook his head slowly and suddenly glanced at Mellad. Mellad was stunned, and then he understood what tribulation meant. Without the slightest hesitation, he directly stretched out his hand, and an extremely pure light suddenly bloomed in his hand. The light was like a tide, surging and converging, and finally fell on Tribulation. The Gate of Hope. This was the Gate of Hope that Mellad had personally opened. This light was so pure and dazzling. Even though it had been worn out by the shadows of King Tong and Paul, it was still like the brightest star in the night sky. Paul's eyes were cold. Mellad could understand what tribulation meant, so could he. In the shadows, almost no one was able to capture his movements with his battle prowess just now. But now there was Tribulation. Tribulation's body was glowing. As long as Tribulation could keep up with Paul's speed, under the light, Paul's advantage would be mostly wasted. The dazzling light wrapped around Tribulation. Under the silver mask, Tribulation's eyes were cold and indifferent. Paul's figure began to slowly retreat. Tribulation seemed to move. The dazzling light seemed to still be there. But the shadow around Paul was instantly dispersed. Before Paul could even realize what was happening, An extremely cold wind suddenly blew in front of him. Paul's heart sank and he quickly retreated. But the next second, a silver mask appeared in front of him. How could it be so fast? The thought turned in his mind for a moment. He clenched Ghost Hand and slashed at it directly. 3 black shadows wrapped in light appeared around Paul at the same time. The scarlet saber light of Ghost Hand split Tribulation's body, but what it hit was only a shadow. Shadow formula. Switching positions. Tribulation, who had changed positions with the shadow, was getting closer to Paul. The 3 shadows and Tribulation himself had made the light continuous. A lot of light shone on Paul, and Paul's figure became clearer than ever. Forbid. A low voice sounded in the night sky. The light, the shadow, and the night sky twisted wildly at the same time. Paul's figure froze for a moment. The next second, Tribulation's hands had begun to make a seal. Slaughter. The 3 dark shadows copied Tribulation's movements at the same time. Crazy power surged from all directions with Tribulation as the center. The nearby twisted space seemed to be completely pulled by Tribulation's handprint. The absolute power was violent and chaotic, roaring as it was pulled by Tribulation and smashed toward Paul. The constantly shaking space was completely out of control. Paul's face changed dramatically in an instant. "You lunatic." Before he finished speaking, a large piece of space, which was constantly twisting and exploding, had directly shrouded him. It enveloped Paul. At the same time, it also enveloped Tribulation. Tribulation's eyes grew colder and colder. He was the strongest assassin in the dark world, so he knew very well how much damage a person like Paul could cause in a stalemate. After tonight, Li Tianlan and Rothschild were mortal enemies. Under such circumstances, Tribulation didn't want to let go of any accident, nor would he give him the slightest chance to break out of the encirclement. The whole situation had begun to collapse gradually. The addition of the 2 invincible realm experts, Violet and Hostile, had given Paul the power to fight back. Together with King Tong, Paul already had 4 invincible realm experts on his side. Arcis of the Vatican hadn't arrived yet. The situation was dragging on. It was not even a question of whether Rothschild would break out of the encirclement, but whether Paul would reverse the whole situation and turn defeat into victory. An assassin-type expert who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm could create any miracle in such a scene. Therefore, Tribulation's actions were extremely intense. He didn't hold back at all. As soon as he got close to Paul, he had already twisted the space within hundreds of meters around him. In the Buddhist incantation of 9 words, the shadow formula was the fastest, the stop formula was similar to the domain, and the slaughter formula was a strong attack. The space within hundreds of meters was constantly twisting and exploding. Tribulation's hands were still making gestures. Destroy. Boom. The whole night sky completely exploded. Countless streams of light flew wildly, looking extremely gorgeous. Tribulation's invincible realm was not stable. The breakthrough back then was too intense. Until today his injuries had not recovered. Therefore he was no match for Paul, and he didn't expect to be able to kill Paul. But his heart was far colder than Paul's. This was the real assassin's heart. Paul's fighting style was that of an assassin, but he didn't have the mentality of an assassin, so he was just the patriarch of Rothschild. Tribulation, on the other hand, was a real assassin. He went all out to twist the void within hundreds of meters around him. Under the confinement of the stop formula, the space that was completely out of control kept exploding, covering Paul and himself. In this completely out of control range, the huge power could destroy everything, hurt Paul, and also hurt Tribulation himself. This was completely a way of dying together. Determined, ruthless, and relentless. Kill. Cass Rotter suddenly opened his hands. A thunderbolt, which was already so dense that it was almost tangible, was constantly condensing in his hands. Cass Rotter's eyes were fierce and crazy. A large area of the void began to flash with thunderbolts. All the thunderbolts were condensed in his hands. A thunderball emitting a faint blue light had condensed between Cass Rotter's hands. At this moment no one hesitated. Everyone understood what Tribulation meant. The Lord of Shadow in the Dark World completely locked on Paul regardless of his own safety. The void kept exploding around the 2 of them. As strong as Paul was, it was impossible for him to completely get rid of this completely out of control domain in a short time. For all the invincible realm experts, this was the best opportunity. The thunderbolts in Cass Rotter's hands shone with an incomparably dazzling light. His open hands suddenly began to close and he placed them on the thunderbolt ball. A huge force surged between his arms, squeezing the lightning orb. Boom. In the deep night sky, there was a sudden sound of thunder that was enough to shock the whole city. The ball that had condensed infinite thunderbolts completely exploded. Thousands of thunderbolts covered the sky and kept falling toward the domain where Tribulation and Paul were. Thunder God strike. This strike completely ignored the enemy and himself. It enveloped Paul and Tribulation at the same time. The black saber light converged with the awe-inspiring sword intent in the thunderbolts all over the sky. Raphael and Qin Shilai were already standing together. The saber light and the sword energy roared wildly. In the out-of-control domain, thunderbolts fell down, and the cold saber light and sword energy flew around like rain. Tribulation seemed to have lost his mind. Countless saber light and sword energy pierced through his body. In the dripping blood he chased after Paul like crazy. Every time Paul flashed he was completely locked on by him. The two figures were constantly entangled in the killing intent all over the sky. More and more blood was on Tribulation's body, but his eyes were getting colder and colder. Brother? King Tong, who was on the ground, desperately condensed her domain, and a large number of shadows flew like a tide. The night sky in the distance was shaking at the same time. The blazing white light of the light of heaven gathered crazily, but a strange domain imprisoned the light of heaven. In that domain heaven and earth seemed to have lost gravity. Countless rays of light floated blankly in the domain, constantly gathering and more. Heaven and earth were useless. Situ Tsangyue, the city governor of Sai City, stood in front of Patriarch Hastile and kept him there. Before the war broke out, she had texted Li Tianlan that she was in Reki City. It wasn't until now that she finally appeared. Everyone was fighting with all their might. The saber light, thunderbolts and sword energy kept circling around. Paul couldn't get rid of Tribulation's desperate entanglement. Tribulation's injury was getting worse. But Paul's body was also stained with blood. His realm was not as good as Paul's. But he dared to die. To die. This was something that most invincible realm experts were unwilling to accept. But Tribulation did it in such an ordinary and resolute way. Violet on the ground finally stopped slaughtering the elites of the major forces. He rushed to the sky with the saber. Mellad finally got the chance. His voice shook the sky and said, "Purification." The pure light on his body soared in an instant. In an instant, light also appeared in the team of the Vatican on the ground. The light gathered on the ground and in the sky. Mellad's figure became extremely majestic in an instant. Buzz. The whole world suddenly buzzed for a moment. A force like a mountain and a sea rose from the ground and whizzed forward with an incomparably fierce momentum. Invincible strike. Another invincible realm expert rushed in at the most critical moment. The huge power gathered into a huge shadow of a fist. The shadow rushed up. This was not a reinforcement. It was Morton. Mellad flew into a rage. But the shadow of the fist swept across the sky. In an instant, it directly hit Raphael and Qin Shilai. The light on Mellad's body suddenly turned, and he was about to block the punch. But a ray of light suddenly appeared in his sight. It was a red light. It was like light extremely weak. On the ground, a few lonely figures appeared in the chaotic crowd. Their eyes were a little blank and cold. However, a faint red light shot out from their eyes, bringing with it an unparalleled danger. Mellad suddenly thought of what His Majesty had told him before. A person whose eyes could glow red? His movements suddenly stiffened for a moment. In the blink of an eye, the punch that went up against the sky appeared directly behind Qin Shilai without Mellad's obstruction. Bang! The loud sound was extremely dull. Qin Shilai's body shook violently, and a large amount of blood mist burst out from all over his body. Chapter 506. This sudden punch could be said to have completely overturned the current situation. At the most anxious time, both Raphael and Qin Shilai had no time to care about other things. The full blow of an invincible realm expert went up against the sky. Mellad, who could have stopped it, hesitated for a moment. So in the blink of an eye, the huge fist shadow condensed with infinite power had already reached the back of Qin Shilai and Raphael. The edge was broken by Paul. Qin Shilai, whose sword energy was already a little weak, directly made the coldest and most rational choice. Even in his heyday, his strength was not as good as Raphael's, let alone in his current weak state. So in the face of this punch, he directly stood behind Raphael and used his body to face the fist shadow. This was not only for Raphael or Li Tianlan. Most importantly, it was for tonight. Li Tianlan and the Snowdance Corps were not the only ones who had a grudge against Rothschild tonight. Qin Shilai was the first invincible realm expert to make a move in this mess. If tonight's plan failed, when Rothschild recovered, Li Tianlan would not be able to bear the revenge of Paul and King Tong, and neither would the Qin clan in Eastern Europe. So tonight they had to win. If they won, they would survive. If they lost, they would die. The punch, which was surging with endless power, completely fell on Qin Shilai's body, and the huge destructive power completely enveloped Qin Shilai. His body seemed to be blank. Qin Shilai was a little confused. In an instant, it seemed that all the warmth in his body rushed out with that blank space. There was a transparent bloody hole in his abdomen. Blood flowed out of the bloody hole and burst out from every part of his body. His body was completely out of control and he fell from the sky. No one knew whether Qin Shilai was alive or dead. But with such a serious injury, even if Qin Shilai was lucky to survive, it meant that the Dark Sword Master was destined to withdraw from the battlefield tonight, and even from the Dark World forever. Some people quit and some joined. As Qin Shilai's figure fell from the sky, another figure directly approached the air where Qin Shilai had been. The domain formed entirely by power was undulating and whistling around him. He clenched his hand and, without hesitation, punched Raphael again. In the surging domain of power, his figure was extremely strong and burly. Vaguely, people could see a dignified and serious face. Lagos Morton. He was the current patriarch of the Morton family, one of the 4 great families in Eastern Europe. He was an expert second only to Qin Shilai on the Holy List. Li Tianlan used the Snowdance Corps to imprison Rothschild's strongest ally, Wang Tianzong. But in the war of breaking out and fighting, Rothschild's trump cards in Eastern Europe were revealed one after another. Violet joined the fray. Patriarch Lawrence joined the battle. Lagos Morton joined the fray. Rothschild now had 5 invincible realm experts. As enemies, Mitchell died, Huan Kong died, and Qin Shilai withdrew from the battle. The 2 invincible realm experts of Rothschild completely turned the situation around in a desperate situation, and the real allies came. Get lost. Raphael, who had been saved by Qin Shilai, completely reacted. In the domain that had gone out of control ahead, the seriously injured Tribulation and Paul were still fighting crazily. The jet black saber light fell into the domain. The fist shadows behind him roared and surged forward with boundless power. Raphael's eyes were bloodshot. He held the dark saint spear tightly and slashed at Lagos with a backhand slash. The ultimate technique of the Knights of Darkness instantly shattered the sky. Raphael was no longer in his peak state. But the suppression of an expert on the divine list over an expert on the holy list was still the most thorough. God Killer. The jet black saber light was cold and treacherous. The saber light condensed and went crazy. In an instant, it appeared in front of Lagos's domain. One strike. With just one strike, the domain of power around Lagos collapsed. The fallen. Raphael's whole body had been completely surrounded by the thick darkness. The night was constantly twisting, surrounding everything around him in Lagos. The distorted night sky turned into giant blades with shocking murderous aura. The dark saber shadows smashed down overwhelmingly. Lagos's face suddenly changed. His body curled up for a moment, and then he stretched out with all his might, turned around and ran away. Dark wanted. All the darkness around Raphael completely turned into a domain. The domain had a radius of hundreds of meters, but it kept shrinking and became extremely sticky in an instant. Lagos's figure became slower and slower in the domain of the dark wanted, and the saber shadows carried by the fallen had already smashed down like a rainstorm. How dare you! A crazed scream suddenly rang out. The crazy saber light lit up around the domain of the dark wanted in an instant. The saber light was violent and ferocious. Violet's figure appeared around the domain. The saber light burst out in an instant as she waved her saber. Lagos didn't hesitate to unleash his domain. Inside and outside the domain of the death wanted, the 2 experts on the holy list attacked with all their might at the same time. Raphael's domain almost exploded in an instant. Raphael's expression was still cold. His figure flashed forward and appeared directly between Violet and Lagos. The dark saint spear was pointed at the sky. Raphael's face was pale and cold. The ultimate move. Dark Gospel. Boom. A large amount of black saber light filled with the aura of death burst out from the dark saint spear and directly enveloped Lagos and Violet. The crazy battle reached its climax in the blink of an eye. Tribulation was still entangled with Paul. All the attacks of Cass Rotter and Mel Ladd were merging with the domain that was out of control. The dark gospel brought with it a thick black fog of death. The fog kept condensing. Lagos and Violet were entangled with Raphael. In the distant sky, the domain of the useless heaven and earth imprisoned a large amount of the light of heaven. The whole night sky was constantly distorted under the white light. Situt Sangyue was still entangled with Patriarch Hastile. The shadow domain that filled the night sky began to shrink slowly. On the ground, King Tong's golden pupils suddenly became extremely cold. The shadow domain shrank for a moment. Paul's momentum dropped in an instant. The pressure on tribulation lightened. But because of the absence of Raphael, even if Paul lost the domain of King Tong, the several invincible realm experts around him still couldn't pose a fatal threat to him. The shadow faded in just a few seconds. But a huge and cold sense of danger rose directly from the ground. The next second the shadow spread again. King Tong's figure directly approached the sky. Without any hesitation the shadow shrouded Paul's figure, and King Tong rushed directly to Mellad. The shadow and the light collided and fought. Blood splattered everywhere. An earth-shattering bang rang out, and the next second, it was continuous. Outside the out-of-control domain, there was no Raphael, no Mellad, and Tribulation who had been seriously injured. With only Cass Rotter left, Paul did not hesitate to attack with all his might. He directly smashed the domain that was completely out of control with one saber strike. Almost at the same time, the useless heaven and earth could no longer imprison more and more light of heaven. The light and the domain completely exploded after reaching the limit. Lagos and Violet also suffered serious injuries and forcibly broke through Raphael's domain. On the three battlefields, 3 explosions rang out almost at the same time. The incomparably great power rushed to the surface of the earth like the end of the world. Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos, Lawrence, Raphael, Situt Sangyue, Cass Rotter, Tribulation and Mellad. The battlefield of the 10 invincible realm experts ushered in the strongest collision. The strongest outburst of the 10 invincible realm experts rushed to the ground at the same time, like a hurricane that suddenly rose in the void. The violent and incredible power almost tore the earth apart in an instant. The hard ground, the tall buildings and everything in the block completely collapsed under the violent power. The entire Reki city seemed to shake violently, and the wide block had been razed to the ground in an instant. Tribulation was covered in blood. His figure stood in the air as if he wanted to do something. But the next moment his figure shook violently and fell directly from the sky. Paul, who was also covered in blood, looked a little pale. He reached out his hand and slowly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. He looked at Cass Rotter and then at the others. The current patriarch of Rothschild, who was so powerful that he almost subverted everyone's cognition, finally laughed. "You lost." His tone was calm and confident. Although Paul was injured, his combat capability was still there. He had survived all the way from the desperate situation to the present. There were now 5 invincible realm experts on their side. And the other side had fallen to the ground with tribulation. Now there were only 4 invincible realm experts. The key was that no one could control Paul's strength. Melad's heart kept sinking. He glanced around again. Arsis still didn't come over. At this time, it was enough for Arsis to go back and forth from the battlefield to the church twice. But Arsis hadn't appeared yet. This could only mean one thing. It wasn't that Arsis didn't want to come, but he couldn't come for the time being. Why was this happening? They lost. With such a huge advantage, did they really lose? "Are you so confident?" A voice suddenly rang out. Cass Rotter looked at Paul and his voice was cold. Paul glanced at him and suddenly laughed. His voice was cold and gloomy. "You're the next one to die." Obviously he had changed his strategy. In the situation where his side was at a disadvantage, his strategy was to kill the weakest invincible realm expert on the other side as soon as possible. The death of the 2 invincible realm experts, Mitchell and Huan Kong, was enough to prove the success of his strategy, and it was also the key to his survival until now. Now Rothschild had a big enough advantage. Paul changed his strategy. He actually wanted to kill the strongest Cass Rotter and completely settle the battle. A crazy roar suddenly rang out. The sounds of slaughter and screams came from all directions. The elites of Rothschild, the Eastern Church, Morton, and the Violet family finally appeared on the battlefield, crazily attacking the formation of the army of Wulon State. Cass Rotter's expression was still calm. He replied to Paul with exactly the same words, confident and calm. "You're the next one to die." "What makes you think so?" Paul asked with narrowed eyes. Cass Rotter didn't say anything. However, a crimson light suddenly shone in front of him. The light kept condensing in front of him, with unparalleled spirituality and extremely fierce danger. In an instant, Paul's whole body was completely locked by an extremely cold and destructive force. Cass Rotter picked up a necklace around his neck. The necklace was small and quaint, looking like a cross. But all the red light was emitted from the cross, and the small cross was changing shape, growing larger and longer. Cass Rotter held the cross, his face grave and solemn. The constantly changing necklace finally turned into an exaggeratedly big gun. It was called a gun, but the muzzle was as big as the muzzle of a cannon. Countless rays of red light were constantly condensing in the muzzle, which looked extremely strange. Cass Rotter pointed the gun at Paul and said calmly, "That's it." Paul stopped laughing. His eyes were fixed on the gun in Cass Rotter's hand. "Holy punishment of void," he said word by word. Holy punishment of void, one of the 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World, was also the only murderous weapon in North America. The red light kept converging. Cass Rotter put his finger on the trigger. Looking at Paul, who was so close that he could not avoid it, he said calmly, "Goodbye." Paul tightened his body and pulled King Tong back quickly without hesitation. Cass Rotter smiled and slowly exerted force with his fingers. Suddenly, another hand appeared on the barrel of the void godly punishment. The extremely hard palm directly blocked the muzzle of the holy punishment of void. Cass Rotter's pupils suddenly shrank. An extremely strange figure suddenly appeared in front of him. The other party was also emitting scarlet light, which almost merged with the light of the holy punishment of void. Cass Rotter was a little confused, but the other party's movements were extremely firm. He let go of his palm and blocked the chest of the holy punishment of void with his body. He held Cass Rotter's body with a pair of hands. Cass Rotter struggled with all his might, but he couldn't get rid of the other party's imprisonment at all. The unimaginable power completely fixed his figure in the void. Cass Rotter's eyes instantly became extremely frightened. In his sight, an expressionless face suddenly became extremely clear. In the red light all over the sky, the other party said calmly, "Die." His body directly crashed into Cass Rotter, and one of his hands directly pressed against Cass Rotter's palm. Boom! The red light all over the sky suddenly exploded. In the chaos of Eastern Europe, for the first time, a murderous weapon opened fire directly. Countless rays of death exploded in the nearest distance and completely enveloped Cass Rotter. Suddenly there was a rain of blood in the air. The red light was still spreading and entangling in the air. Vaguely, an object emitting red light fell down and landed in the rain on the ground. A figure walked over and bent down to pick up the object that had fallen into the water. It was an eyeball. The eyeball had not been opened, so the light in the pupil was extremely weak. The figure held the eyeball and looked at it silently for a while. In the rain of blood all over the sky, he opened his mouth and directly ate the eyeball. Chapter 507. For everyone in the Dark World, the night of August 17th was destined to be extremely long. The constantly changing situation affected everyone's heart. In the office of the president, the chaos of the situation even diluted Li Tianlan's surprise at Qin Weibai's sudden arrival. Li Tianlan's expression was still calm. But his heart kept falling with the changing situation, as if he had fallen from heaven to hell, from summer to winter. The screen in front of him was filled with red light. The murderous weapon in North America, the holy punishment of void, had been silent for a long time. This time, Cass Rotter fired with all his might, and its lethality could be said to be at its peak. The whole night sky was completely dyed red. The heavy rain in the night was still raging, but the dark night seemed to suddenly have countless burning clouds. The incomparably gorgeous colors burned the whole sky. The red clouds kept fluttering and the void was burned, twisted, and hollow. Li Tianlan watched this scene quietly and remained silent for a long time. At this moment, in different parts of the world, countless people were silent. The holy punishment of void did not take a long time to accumulate energy, but it was longer than the murderous weapon setting sun of Jianghu state. So of course, its power was also stronger than setting Sunday. And Cass Rotter's real strength, strictly speaking, was not even as good as Gu Xingyun. It was self-evident what this meant. Everything that had happened just now was too weird. Cass Rotter took out the holy punishment of void and aimed it at Paul. A figure burning with red light could actually ignore the domain formed before the holy punishment of void was fired and directly appeared in front of Cass Rotter. This was weird enough. But what was even more incomprehensible was that the moment the other party appeared in front of Cass Rotter was completely controlled by the other party without any ability to resist. So Cass Rotter detonated the murderous weapon. In front of him, this shot could even be said to have been fired at himself. Why did this happen? The only reasonable explanation was that the other party was stronger than Cass Rotter. The person who could control Cass Rotter the moment he got close to him should at least be a top expert at the peak of the invincible realm, such as deity Lin Fengting or Arceus. Such an expert had the strength to sweep the whole field. If he was properly prepared, he could also resist a blow from the murderous weapon. The other party had no reason to die with Cass Rotter. But if that person was not at the peak of the invincible realm, how did he control Cass Rotter? Li Tianlan's mind went blank. The red clouds that filled the sky continued to rise, burying the truth and evaporating everything. At this moment, Li Tianlan suddenly didn't want to think about anything. He did not understand how the other party had controlled Cass Rotter. But that was no longer important. Most importantly, at such a close distance, the energy of the godly punishment of the void was pouring out in torrents. There was no longer any possibility of Cass Rotter surviving. The god of war of Star State eventually died in Eastern Europe. From earlier Jiang Chenyin, Black Ghost, Chaos to tonight's Mitchell, Huan Kong and now Cass Rotter. The chaos in Eastern Europe had torn apart the lives of 6 invincible realm experts. In addition to Qin Shilai, whose life or death was unknown for the time being, there might be 7 of them. How many invincible realm experts were there in the world? But the general trend in Eastern Europe was still surging with the wind and rain, and a torrent seemed to never stop. Li Tianlan looked at the screen in front of him, but his eyes seemed to lose focus. The red glow on the screen began to dissipate. The light disappeared, and the distorted space gradually calmed down. The heavy rain fell, and it was as if nothing had happened. It seemed that something had fallen from the sky. The murderous weapon had disappeared from the place where the godly punishment of the void had just been fired. Cass Rotter had also disappeared. It was as if he had never existed. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes tightly. The power in the field had been presented in the most obvious manner. Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos and Hustile. Raphael, Situt Sangyue and Mellad. 8 invincible realm experts. Strictly speaking, Mellad was just Li Tianlan's partner. The Vatican could change its position at any time. So strictly speaking, only Situt Sangyue and Raphael were on Li Tianlan's side at this time. Li Tianlan could not hear Paul's words. But he knew that he had lost. From the very beginning he had the upper hand. But now the situation had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Everything that Li Tianlan had done tonight could be said to be a real failure. And the most fatal loophole in all this was that their side had seriously underestimated Paul's strength. After joining hands with King Tong, Paul could be said to be a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm. He alone had stalled several invincible realm experts for too long, which directly overturned everything that Li Tianlan had carefully prepared. He turned the situation around with his own strength. This was the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. All the unwillingness in his heart seemed to turn into a flame in his body. His whole body seemed to be on fire, but his expression was terrifyingly calm. "It's my mistake," Qin Weibai, who had been sitting next to Li Tianlan, suddenly said. The estimation of Paul's strength was completely provided by the Samsara Palace. According to the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, Paul's current strength should be able to enter the divine list, but it was slightly inferior to King Tong's. But the actual situation was a little wrong. With the strength that Paul had shown tonight, even 2 King Tongs were not as good as Paul. The mistake in the intelligence directly led to everything that happened tonight. Otherwise, everything would have gone smoothly tonight. "It's not your fault." Li Tianlan shook his head. Tonight's mistake seemed to be because of the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, but it also made Li Tianlan realize his own flaws. At this moment, Li Tianlan finally admitted that no matter how perfect his willpower was in martial arts, he was still a little impetuous in the general trend. It was not a mistake to trust the intelligence of the Samsara Palace. The biggest mistake was that his plan was too crazy. Crazy meant extreme rash. He went forward with indomitable will, leaving no room for leeway. Such a plan often meant that he could master everything perfectly. So when Paul's strength exceeded his expectations, the whole plan had been completely out of control. It was doomed to fail. Doomed? Li Tianlan asked himself subconsciously. Is it really doomed? The moment this question came up, he asked himself again. There's still a chance. Li Tianlan suddenly said. Of course. Qin Weibai chuckled and said softly, Tianlan, do you know Sun Tzu's art of war? Most of the time, the more complicated and unfavorable the situation is, the more we have to deal with it in the simplest way. Tonight in Reki City, you can do whatever you want regardless of victory or defeat. Li Tianlan didn't speak. He just glanced at the screen again. There was no room for his plan. but in fact there was a lot of room. When Qin Shilai and Tribulation withdrew from the battlefield, and Raphael and Situ Tsangyue were not in their peak state, Li Tianlan still had a trump card that he hadn't used. He himself hadn't moved yet. In today's complicated and unfavorable situation, the simplest way was for him to rush over with the elites of the Snowdance Corps. He would face Paul, King Tong, Violet, Lagos and Hastile. The incomparably huge pressure surged over like a mountain or a sea. Li Tianlan's eyes were quiet and deep. "I can't lose," he said softly. He couldn't and he was unwilling. Everything that happened tonight should have had a very perfect ending in his plan. But if the situation continued to develop in the case of a crushing defeat, not to mention a perfect ending, even the advantage that Li Tianlan had built in Reki City would be completely ruined. The chaos in Eastern Europe might not end tonight, but after tonight, the overall situation was bound to become clear. At this critical moment, if Li Tianlan admitted defeat and left Reki City, there would be no place for the Snowdance Corps in all of Eastern Europe. If he returned to Zhongzhou State with such a result, the future of him and the Li family would become bleak. Li Tianlan was now like a gambler who knew he would lose but couldn't afford to lose at all. His eyes were red and he almost lost his mind and wanted to bet everything he had. Li Tianlan was looking at the screen. Qin Weibai was looking at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan didn't move. But Qin Weibai clearly noticed that there was a kind of unwillingness in him, struggling, burning, and finally becoming crazy and hysterical. Her eyes were gentle and affectionate, but there was a trance in the depths of her eyes. It seemed that in the memory of a long, long time ago, but also as if it was yesterday, there was also a man who had amazed the whole dark world. In the face of a great dilemma he was silent, struggling and crazy. At that time she was still very naive and childish. Thus, she watched as the man walked into a predicament in silence, walked into a hopeless situation, and finally buried everything he had. The memory passed through the quiet years and was shrouded in light. Li Tianlan's figure seemed to be merging with the memory, and they were inseparable. Qin Weibai suddenly laughed. She reached out and put her palm in Li Tianlan's hand. "Nothing is perfect," she said softly, "but there is nothing that can't be made up for. Tianlan, you won't lose." Her voice was gentle and firm. Today, tonight. She was Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan's woman. Now she was not naive or childish. She had the real qualification to stand by Li Tianlan's side. Li Tianlan might not be perfect now. But Qin Weibai firmly believed that standing by Li Tianlan's side was Li Tianlan's perfection. The intelligence of Samsara Palace could be wrong. She could also make mistakes. But she would not allow herself to fail. The silver bracelet on Li Tianlan's left hand lit up. The sword intent was extremely abundant, and the light on the silver bracelet shone more brightly. This sword, Qin Weibai looked at the silver light on Li Tianlan's wrist and whispered, "It's not perfect. Even if it's not perfect, I still have to use it." Li Tianlan whispered. The silver edge spread in his hand. Falling stars was the first choice in his hand. However, at this moment, some subtle cracks had appeared on the silver blade of falling stars. Li Tianlan looked at the cracks on the blade and remained silent. The spirituality is not enough, the sword energy is not strong, and the sword body is also incomplete. Since it's not perfect, then don't use it. Qin Weibai looked at Li Tianlan. There was a very obvious hesitation in her eyes, but she finally made up her mind. She said with a smile, "Tianlan, how about I give you a sword?" Li Tianlan was a little confused. "What kind of sword?" "Of course, it's a real magic weapon that is most suitable for you and worthy of your future." Qin Weibai stared at Li Tianlan's face and her eyes were a little sad. She turned her head and glanced at the screen. On the screen, the red light all over the sky completely dissipated. It was late at night. Qin Weibai suddenly asked, "Tianlan, do you know how the people of the Devil Troop just controlled Cass Rotter?" Chapter 508. The Devil Troop. Although he had a hunch in his heart, Li Tianlan still felt a little cold when he heard Qin Weibai's words. The Devil Troop was the most mysterious force of the Wang family of Beihai. It was also the trump card that Wang Tianzong could still play in Reki City even though he was imprisoned tonight. But Li Tianlan had never known what the Devil Troop was. So in his uneasiness and anxiety, the sudden appearance of the Devil Troop gave him an absolute surprise, and then disappeared in an instant. The way the other party perished together was extremely tragic. But Cass Rotter's death also completely determined Li Tianlan's defeat tonight. This surprise was absolutely important to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. The Devil Troop. Who the hell are they? They are a group of monsters that are neither alive nor dead, Qin Weibai said softly. Their state is very special, and their bodies are even more special so they can control murderous weapons. Li Tianlan vaguely understood. He looked at Qin Weibai and asked, can they control murderous weapons? The death of Cass Rotter has proved this. Qin Weibai said, at the moment when the holy punishment of void was fired, it was not Cass Rotter who was really controlled, but the holy punishment of void. To be more precise, it was the murderous weapons that rebelled, which eventually caused Cass Rotter's death. The holy punishment of void was controlled. The murderous weapons rebelled. Li Tianlan looked at Qin Weibai as if he were listening to a fantasy story. Murderous weapons can also rebel? Dongqing Rushi came over and asked curiously. The murderous weapons themselves are a kind of living metal. They have their own intelligence, so they are extremely powerful. However, we can't understand this kind of life form for the time being, so we can only make use of their power. Qin Weibai said, anything with intelligence and life can betray us. But it's not easy. Li Tianlan suddenly said. Qin Weibai nodded. But for the Wang family of Beihai, it's not necessarily difficult. Tianlan, you should have heard that the 13 murderous weapons come from the same piece of life metal. And this piece of life metal was obtained by the ancestor of the Wang family of Beihai after he defeated a strong opponent. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Qin Weibai's voice was a little cold. Murderous weapons have lives. It's not easy to make murderous weapons rebel. But since they have lives, they naturally have thoughts. What if the holy punishment of the void thought that the people of the Devil Troop were their own kind at that moment? Li Tianlan suddenly raised his head and looked at Qin Weibai, his eyes burning. Qin Weibai's tone was calm, as if she was talking about the simplest fact. The murderous weapon can make the murderous weapon think that the other person is its own kind. Naturally, there are a few fragments of the murderous weapon in the body of every person in the Devil Troop. You mean? Li Tianlan's voice suddenly became unprecedentedly dry. Every member of the Devil Troop is a murderous weapon? In essence, every member of the Devil Troop was once an invincible realm expert of the Wang family of Beihai. Their bodies will age and their realms will decline, but in order to protect the Wang family of Beihai, they willingly accepted the transformation of the Wang family of Beihai. This transformation is very complicated, and the most important thing is the implantation of the murderous weapon fragments. The implantation of the murderous weapon fragments will integrate the spirituality of the fragments with their physical skills, so that their bodies will always be alive. After that, the Wang family of Beihai should take measures similar to freezing and completely seal these people. They will die. Dongqing Rushi suddenly said seriously. Qin Weibai glanced at her and nodded. The Wang family of Beihai has the Immortality Potion. The reason why the production of the Immortality Potion is rare is that several of the medicines are hard to find in the world. But the rarest materials are not for making the Immortality Potion. Do you understand? For example, to make a pure Immortality Potion, it needs about 60 kinds of precious materials, but to make a finished Immortality Potion, it needs 80 kinds of materials. The latter 20 kinds of materials are added to neutralize some of the side effects of the Immortality Potion. Without these 20 kinds of materials, it is also the Immortality Potion with the same massive vitality or even more powerful, but it is also a kind of poison that can make people doomed eternally. After adding the latter 20 kinds of medicines, the Immortality Potion is the most precious Immortality Potion, because it has no side effects and can be taken by people. But for the Devil Troop, what they need is the simplest Immortality Potion, which is vitality. This kind of medicine combined with the frozen environment can keep their bodies alive for a long time. But the poison of the Immortality Potion will gradually make them lose all their memories. The spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality will combine with each other and turn them into monsters that will only obey orders. They don't feel pain and they don't even have much thinking. Their only goal is to complete the task. They used to be experts of the invincible realm in the Wang family of Beihai. Even if their martial arts have degenerated over a long time, their bodies will always be close to the peak state under the stimulation of the Immortality Potion. Under such circumstances, the realm they show may be the fire-flaming realm or the thunder-shocking realm, but it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that their defense, speed, and even strength are all in the invincible realm. This is the Devil Troop of the Wang family of Beihai. The Wang family of Beihai replaced people's souls with the spirituality of the murderous weapon fragments and the vitality of the Immortality Potion, turning the former experts of the invincible realm into war machines that can only fight by instinct. That's why the holy punishment of Void regarded the devil troop as its own kind and betrayed Cass Rotter. Li Tianlan took a deep drag on the cigarette. The thick smoke poured into his lungs and he suddenly coughed violently. Dongqing Rushi and Qin Weibai's delicate palms fell on Li Tianlan's back almost at the same time. Qin Weibai took a glass of water and handed it to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan drank up the water in the quilt. After a moment of silence, he asked, "How many of such devil troop does the Wang family of Beihai have?" "I don't know the exact number. But it won't be less than 20. The oldest devil troop has even been sleeping for hundreds of years. As far as I know, the Wang family of Beihai once used the devil troop on Mount Dibing more than 20 years ago. At that time 12 of them were dispatched. If I'm not mistaken, the ones who came to Eastern Europe this time should also be these 12. Qin Weibai said softly, "The vitality of the immortality potion is the most effective when it is frozen. Otherwise, how can they survive for hundreds of years? In the eyes of the Wang family of Beihai, the devil troop is the most luxurious consumable. They used it once more than 20 years ago. Even if it was frozen immediately, the damage to their vitality should be very serious. When the devils enter the human world, they won't live for long. This time Wang Tianzong should want to use them all in Eastern Europe." Li Tianlan nodded and took a deep look at the screen. The battlefield on the screen once again became extremely chaotic. However, the situation had been completely reversed from before. Raphael and Situt Sangyue had already met up. Melad also approached them. Outside them, 5 invincible realm experts, Paul, King Tong, Lagos, Hastile, and Violet, were frantically besieging 3 invincible realm experts. On the ground, the elites of Rothschild finally arrived at the battlefield, followed by the elites of Morton and the Violet family. The streets were in a mess and the war was everywhere. Li Tianlan stood up and looked at the screen. His eyes gradually became sharp. "There's still a chance," Qin Weibai said softly. "As long as Arcis and Charlemagne arrive at the battlefield, there is still hope to turn the situation around." "I won't wait any longer," Li Tianlan suddenly said. "If we wait any longer, they won't be able to hold on." Charlemagne and Arcis hadn't arrived yet. But they would definitely arrive. The situation tonight had been delayed by Paul until now. Paul would definitely know better than anyone that it would be equally disadvantageous for them to delay. Therefore, although Paul had just consumed a lot of physical strength, his attack at this time was still extremely fierce. Situt Sangyue couldn't hold on any longer. Raphael couldn't hold on either. "I'll go," Li Tianlan said as if he was talking to himself. He nodded and repeated, "Well, I'll go." Dongqing Rushi opened her mouth subconsciously. She glanced at Qin Weibai and fell silent again. Li Tianlan would definitely join this battlefield. But compared to the plan, it was much earlier and the risk was much higher. "You should do what you want to do." Qin Weibai walked up to Li Tianlan, reached out to touch his face and said softly, "Don't worry, you will win as long as you are willing to do your best." "Of course." Li Tianlan laughed. He directly turned off the screen in front of him. There was no point in watching it. If he couldn't make a comeback tonight, the advantage of Reki City would disappear, everything they had in Eastern Europe would not exist, and the future of the Li family would not exist either. So he couldn't afford to lose. He had to win. Li Tianlan held Qin Weibai's hand that was stroking his face, feeling the gentleness and fragrance. He took a deep breath, looked at Dongqing Rushi again and said calmly, "Wait for me to come back." He turned around and walked to the door. At the same time, he put on the communication device in the Snowdance core and said blandly, "Gather." In an instant, the entire office of the president was in motion. The room became extremely quiet. Dongqing Rushi looked at Qin Weibai quietly. Qin Weibai was also looking at Dongqing Rushi. After a long time, she seemed to have confirmed something, and her eyes became softer. "Sister, should we wait for him to come back?" Dongqing Rushi suddenly asked. "You have to wait." Qin Weibai whispered, "I won't wait." "What?" Dongqing Rushi asked subconsciously. "I'm going to Zhongzhou State," Qin Weibai said. Qin Weibai said, "I just said that I will give Tianlan a real magic weapon, one that can match his future sword intent." "Is there really such a sword?" Dongqing Rushi was a little doubtful. There were too many famous swords in the world with unparalleled sharpness, but they were dead objects after all. In Kendo, the sword energy was either sharp or ethereal, and it moved according to one's heart. Therefore, after the invincible realm, every invincible realm expert in Kendo wanted to find a famous sword that could perfectly carry his sword intent. Silence in Dongqing Rushi's hand was won. Sharpness of the Qin clan in Eastern Europe was also one. As for the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world, almost no famous sword could carry their sword intent perfectly. When they reached the peak of the invincible realm, they needed swords with intelligence. That was murderous weapons. Falling Stars in Li Tianlan's hand could almost be regarded as the ultimate sword. In terms of sharpness, Falling Stars might not be sharper than famous swords like Listen to the Sea, Sharpness, and Silence. It might even be a little worse. But in terms of intelligence, Falling Stars was far better than other famous swords. But Li Tianlan's sword intent was also extremely strong. Qin Weibai said that there was a divine weapon worthy of Li Tianlan's future. Li Tianlan was destined to surpass the peak of the invincible realm in the future and become the chosen one. What kind of sword could perfectly carry the sword intent of the chosen one? Dongqing Rushi couldn't imagine the sharpness of that sword at all. Yes. Qin Weibai said softly, in Zhongzhou State in Lin'an. Dongqing Rushi looked at Qin Weibai and was silent for a while. Then, she was a little hesitant, and there was undisguised worry in her clear eyes. What should we do here tonight? Qin Weibai looked at her and seemed to think for a moment. Then she chuckled and said, tonight, very good. What's good about it? Dongqing Rushi thought about the situation shown on the screen just now and asked without relaxing. The current situation was extremely obvious. There were only Situ Tsangyue and Raphael on their side. Paul, on the other hand, was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. Even if Arcis could really arrive in time, Charlemagne of the Heroes Club would also take action, and their side would no longer have an overwhelming advantage. At best, it could only be said that there was a chance. Dongqing Rushi's heart moved slightly and she asked carefully and softly, Sister, do you have any other arrangements for Reki City tonight? No. Qin Weibai smiled and said, everything tonight is Tianlan's plan. His plan conflicts with mine, so I changed my mind. But Tianlan's plan is not perfect. Dongqing Rushi was silent for a while and then said softly, there are indeed loopholes in his plan, but in terms of the general trend, it is already perfect. Don't worry about some flaws. Qin Weibai's eyes were a little dazed, as if she had seen Li Tianlan's situation. He stood in a desperate situation where he thought there was no way out, but he didn't know that there was a greater force behind him. Qin Weibai thought quietly and her eyes were calm. She was the greatest perfection in Li Tianlan's life. But tonight, Li Tianlan's perfection was not her. That night was the trial day. But tonight had greatly deviated from the original plan. The trial was still going on. But it was no longer the trial day that belonged to her. Qin Weibai came to her senses, smiled and said, I'm leaving. Dongqing Rushi wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Qin Weibai walked over, tidied Dongqing Rushi's hair and said softly, don't let your imagination run wild. Tianlan will be fine. You, me, Yuatong and Tianlan, we are destined to be together. Dongqing Rushi blushed, bit her lip and didn't speak. Qin Weibai took a deep look at her, turned around and left. Sister. Dongqing Rushi's voice suddenly sounded. Qin Weibai stopped where she was and didn't look back. You came today? Dongqing Rushi suddenly felt a little confused. Did you just pass by? If Samsara Palace really didn't have any arrangement for everything tonight, then why did Qin Weibai appear here? Oh. Qin Weibai smiled and said, I came to see Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong was still drinking tea and he was not sleepy at all. The water in the teapot had been changed twice, but the fragrance was still there. He held the cup and sipped, and his mind seemed to be completely immersed in his own world. Wang Tianzong was very focused in this state. It was like meditation. When Qin Weibai walked into the room, Wang Tianzong was holding the teapot and pouring water. His silhouette was reflected in her line of sight, looking incomparably lofty and lonely. The tea is good, Qin Weibai said. Wang Tianzong said yes and said, have a taste. Qin Weibai came over and sat opposite Wang Tianzong. The tea was the tea that Li Tianlan had drunk. Wang Tianzong added a small amount of special potion in it. However, this kind of potion that could distract people had no effect on her. In the spiritual field, Qin Weibai was not yet in the transcendent realm. But she was definitely the person closest to the transcendent realm. Why are you here? Wang Tianzong asked. His emotions didn't fluctuate, only calmness. If Qin Weibai didn't come tonight or came a little later, maybe a lot of things would have happened now. Maybe Li Tianlan would have cooperated with him now. Maybe the pattern of Zhongzhou State and the Dark World for the next 100 years would be determined tonight. There were many maybes. Wang Tianzong felt a little regretful, but he was not angry. You're hurting him. Wang Tianzong said softly, and his tone was a little emotional. He really felt that it was a pity. Until now, he thought that it was the best choice for Li Tianlan to enter the Wang family of Beihai and Wang Yuetong to be the patriarch. Qin Weibai seemed a little confused. She looked at Wang Tianzong and suddenly asked, Your Majesty, do you really think it's a good thing for Tianlan to join the Wang family of Beihai? Wang Tianzong was a little silent. After a while, he said slowly, At least for me and him, this is the best situation. Qin Weibai smiled. Her smile was a little cold, but it was still perfect and exquisite, with a kind of charm that could topple a country. It's the best for you. She said softly, It's not too bad for Tianlan personally, but now he is more than just him. Some things should have been abandoned long ago. Wang Tianzong looked cold and waved his hand. Qin Weibai didn't seem to want to dwell on this topic. She drank a cup of tea and said softly, He's the best when I'm with him. When she said this, she didn't show off or be arrogant, only endless softness. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. I came here today just to see His Majesty. Qin Weibai shook her head and answered Wang Tianzong's original question. I don't know if I should be surprised or disappointed with His Majesty's current state. Her eyes were bright and calm, and her gaze was extremely sharp. Wang Tianzong glanced at her. His eyes were a little dignified, but at this time there was a little more smile. The Wang family of Beihai has never let anyone down. Wang Tianzong said with a smile, The sword of Beihai is the same. The sword of Beihai is really sharp and unparalleled. Qin Weibai replied meaningfully. Wang Tianzong's pupils shrank slightly. For a long time he didn't speak. I heard that the Wang family of Beihai is forging swords? His Majesty should be preparing for his own breakthrough and wants a divine weapon that can carry your sword intent, right? Qin Weibai suddenly asked. Wang Tianzong's eyes narrowed tightly, and a trace of gloom flashed in the depths of his eyes. The Wang family of Beihai forged swords. The coldness of 9 states. This matter was the top secret of the top secrets in the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Tianzong knew it. Summer Solstice knew it. In addition, only a few sword-forging staff knew it. No one would tell this news. The question was, how did Qin Weibai know it? How is the progress of the divine weapon? Qin Weibai's tone was straightforward and calm. How is His Majesty's current state? Wang Tianzong seemed to have completely calmed down and said indifferently, Not far away. Qin Weibai nodded and said, I also have a sword. I want to see the peerless divine weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. Now it seems that it is not the right time. Don't worry. Wang Tianzong laughed. You know the coldness of 9 states, but you are still so confident. So, I also want to see how your so-called divine weapon is. In the chaos of Eastern Europe, you will see me in the coldness of 9 states. The coldness of 9 states, Qin Weibai said to herself in a somewhat complicated tone. She slowly put down the teacup and said calmly, In this case, I will wait for the Wang family of Beihai to shine the brightest in hundreds of years. She stood up. After a few words, she had already planned to leave. Wang Tianzong looked at her back with some surprise. So soon? Qin Weibai's figure paused. She turned to look at Wang Tianzong and said calmly, As I said, I came here tonight to see you. As long as you can't break through tonight, I can temporarily leave Eastern Europe with peace of mind. At present, it seems that you have no possibility of breaking through tonight, so you can't get involved in what happens outside the Caesar Hotel. Oh, Wang Tianzong said. He looked up at his watch. Now, he looked at Qin Weibai seriously. I don't think the battle in front of the Caesar Hotel is optimistic, right? Rothschild may be passive at first, but now how many of your allies have died? Mitchell, Chaos, Cass Rotter. Qin Weibai told the truth. Tribulation and Qin Shilai have withdrawn from the battlefield. 5 people are missing. Wang Tianzong nodded. When will Samsara Palace take action? Of course when you break through. Qin Weibai answered without hesitation. So, the master of Samsara Palace is really not dead? Wang Tianzong thought of some rumors, narrowed his eyes and hid all his emotions. Qin Weibai did not speak. Not speaking was a tacit agreement. It doesn't matter. Wang Tianzong was silent for a while and said blandly, After tonight the general trend will be changed. Tianlan is destined to ruin his advantage in Reki City tonight. I'm here now, but I won't wait until dawn. I will become the master here. The master here? Qin Weibai couldn't help laughing. Your Majesty, do you think Tianlan will lose? The situation is already obvious. Wang Tianzong asked, How can he win? Indeed, the situation is already obvious. Qin Weibai nodded. But I have a question. You know Rothschild's allies, their lineup and Paul's strength. Naturally, you have also expected the scene in front of the Caesar Hotel. In this case, why did you show your bottom line to Tianlan before? Why did you want to protect Paul and King Tong? The muscles at the corners of Wang Tianzong's eyes twitched, and he suddenly fell silent. Your Majesty, the situation is so obvious. Tell me, how can Tianlan lose? Qin Weibai was aggressive. You know everything that happened tonight. Even the current scene is meaningless. From the moment you were placed under house arrest here, Tianlan had already won. Several allies died and 2 invincible realm experts withdrew from the battlefield. Even if Raphael and Situ Tsangyue all died here, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, as long as Tianlan was still here, he would not lose. Qin Weibai looked at Wang Tianzong. You know this better than anyone else. As long as you don't make a breakthrough, Tianlan is truly invincible in Reki City tonight. Lose? Do you think it's possible? Wang Tianzong was still silent. His silence was also a tacit agreement. If he didn't make a move tonight, Li Tianlan would be invincible in the world. Very few people know this. But this was the truth. Perhaps Li Tianlan himself didn't know that his current disadvantage was meaningless to Rothschild. As Qin Weibai said, even if the entire Snowdance Corps was wiped out, even if all the invincible realm experts on his side withdrew from the battlefield, even if all the invincible realm experts standing beside him rebelled, as long as he was still there, he could use the most powerful means to save all this. Wang Tianzong knew this. That was why he showed his bottom line in advance. Tonight, do you want to go to war with the whole dark world? Wang Tianzong suddenly asked. In my plan, there should be some time before this night. That is the real trial day. Everyone is guilty. I will use all my strength to judge the whole dark world. Qin Weibai said calmly, but Tianlan started his plan first. I can only take a step back. His plan may not be mature enough, but it doesn't matter. A plan with a 100% success rate doesn't need the so-called maturity and correction. So tonight's trial day is the trial of the Li family. Your Majesty, you are imprisoned here. I should congratulate you for escaping. Although it's only temporary. The meaning of this sentence couldn't be more obvious. If Li Tianlan hadn't planned the war in front of the Caesar Hotel tonight, as time went by, if the real trial day was planned by Qin Weibai, even Wang Tianzong was bound to die. Wang Tianzong shook his head with a smile. You are very confident. It's just a fact. Qin Weibai said blandly, after tonight the chaos in Eastern Europe can basically end, but I am still looking forward to the final ending. I am looking forward to your Majesty's breakthrough and the sharpness of the coldness of 9 states. Tianlan will make the most complicated situation simple. In the last and simplest situation, I will personally end the glory of the Wang family of Beihai. After the trial, it was not the end. Wang Tianzong would not be willing to end it. When the trial was over, there must be an end. Wang Tianzong stopped talking and turned around again. Qin Weibai continued to move forward. She opened the door and walked out. A slight but pervasive sword intent suddenly rose in the room. The sword intent tore the window lattice in front of Wang Tianzong. The wind and rain poured in and it was a little cold. Wang Tianzong held the teacup and looked out of the window quietly. Heaven and earth were long. The night rain was boundless. His eyes were deep and cold and eventually became the most complete silence. Chapter 509. The night in Snow City was even colder than that in Reki City. This was an area shrouded in the polar night. When the polar night fell, it was night 24 hours a day in Snow City. There was no wind or rain in Snow City at night. The lights were bright and it looked extremely quiet. In the northernmost part of Snow City, in the area connected to the mountains, there was a huge manor with a vast area, which was almost equivalent to 2 or 3 blocks. The huge and almost vast manor contained the tranquility of the nearby mountains and rivers and the prosperity of the streets, which was extraordinary. Countless lights were lit up in the manor, almost illuminating the whole manor as if it was daytime. This was Snow City, and it could even be said to be the most prominent place in the vast territory of the northeast of Snow Country. No matter from which angle, this manor, which was so huge that it seemed to be able to swallow the whole Snow City, could bring a very heavy sense of oppression to people. It was a kind of coldness and nobleness that was built up with countless wealth and power. It was an irresistible pressure. There were figures everywhere in the brightly lit manor. Countless heavily armed elites occupied various advantageous formations, almost surrounding the manor like an iron bucket. A very subtle and uneasy aura spread out from the manor, quietly echoing in the whole snow city. The mountains in the distance were hidden in the night, faintly visible. On a low peak not far from the manor, two pairs of eyes were looking down at the incomparably huge and bright manor. The night was dark and the white clothes were whiter than snow. A man and a woman, both in white robes, looked mysterious and ethereal. The night wind blew through the mountains, and the white robes carried a large amount of sword intent. The sword intent spread out, and the cold sword energy whistled in the mountains with the wind, looking awe-inspiring. Amidst the mournful howling of the wind, a melodious bell suddenly rang out. The man in white took out his mobile phone and glanced at it. The faint light of the mobile phone shone on his face. The man's face was a little pale, but every line on his face was extremely sharp. This was undoubtedly a very attractive man. Even though he was no longer young, he still had a kind of almost flamboyant handsomeness, looking very aggressive. He quietly glanced at the text message on the mobile phone screen and frowned slightly. "We're late." He suddenly spoke in a low voice, but it was extremely pleasant to the ear. A woman in white stood beside him, looking down at the PDA in her hands. The image on the computer was constantly rotating at a very fast speed. As the image rotated, it would occasionally flash a corner of the manor in the distance. At this moment, there seemed to be someone hiding in the huge manor in the distance and moving quickly. The woman's eyes were cold and serious. Her appearance was not beautiful, but her clear eyes looked extremely attractive. The wind with sword intent blew her hair. She casually tidied up her hair and said seriously, "Han Chongyang and Yun Qinshi didn't fight either." The woman's voice paused for a moment before she continued, "The other party is fast." The man narrowed his eyes and remained silent. "As long as His Highness can hold on, it doesn't matter if it's faster or slower here." The woman continued. The man smiled bitterly and shook his head. "I'm afraid that His Highness can't hold on. The current situation." He thought about the contents of the message and looked at the manor in the distance, not saying a word for a long time. The defense of the entire manor was becoming more and more complete. The man's eyes fell on the tall gate of the manor, which was almost as tall as the city gate. The precious alloy gate was shining with a cold metallic brilliance. On the silver door panel, a huge purple flower was carved on it, which looked strange and gorgeous. Violet. Snow City in the northeast of Snow Country in Eastern Europe was the headquarters of the Violet family. At this time, the man and woman standing on the low peak had been lurking in Snow City for half a month, just for this night. The man seemed a little cold and sharp and his eyes narrowed tightly. The sword energy flew and his whole person looked more and more fierce. After the restart, the Snowdance Corps had many experts including Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud, Yin and Yang Phantom, and even Fireman, a top expert of the older generation of the half-step invincible realm. The lineup was strong and there were many experts. But only a small number of people standing at the peak in Jianghu State knew that the strongest person in the Snowdance Corps today, apart from Li Tianlan, was not Fireman, the assassin from Sai City, or the swordsman from Mount Shu, but he who was standing on the low peak at this moment had never appeared in the Snowdance Corps since the outbreak of the war. Su Chang'e, the sword justice of Jade Pool in Jianghu State. He was the junior brother of Dongqing Wudi, the executive minister of the army headquarters of Jianghu State, the master of Dongqing Rushi, and the recognized #1 expert in Jade Pool. Su Chang'e held the famous sword of Jade Pool, blowing snow. His sword energy was even stronger than that of the current leader of Jade Pool and first elder Ling Shuangxue. Su Chang'e entered Jade Pool at the age of 15 and was 46 years old this year. For more than 30 years he had hardly left Jade Pool. He was the most low-key expert in Jade Pool and had never appeared on any list in Jianghu State. This time he came to Eastern Europe for the sake of his senior brother and disciple. However, to everyone's surprise, although Su Chang'e and Ling Shuangxue came to Eastern Europe, there was no news from them, as if they had disappeared out of thin air. Jianghu State had felt uneasy about this and had asked Li Tianlan. But Li Tianlan did not explain. Until now, people in Jianghu State and even in the Dark World did not know that the Sword Justice and First Elder of Jade Pool had been lingering near the headquarters of the Violet family. After more than 10 days and several careful investigations, the two finally figured out the internal situation of the Violet family. Tonight, Reki City ushered in the trial day. The Violet family, which dominated Snow Country and could cover the sky with one hand, was bound to be destroyed with the departure of the invincible realm expert Violet. Su Chang'e remained motionless. The long sword named Blowing Snow kept buzzing behind him. The sword energy rose into the sky and kept whistling like a mad dragon. Ling Shuangxue stood beside him and quietly looked at the picture on the handheld computer. Tonight, Eastern Europe was bound to be turned upside down. They were near the Violet Manor at this time. At the same time, other high-level members of the Snowdance group must have arrived around the Morton family. And if everything went well, the two assassins of Sai City should have been flying in all the countries of Eastern Europe at this time. Li Tianlan knew about the cooperation between Morton, Violet, and the Eastern Church with Rothschild. For him, this was the best opportunity. The war broke out in front of the Caesar Hotel. Violet, Lagos, and the three invincible realm experts of the Eastern Church immediately led the elites of their respective families and forces to Reki City. For them, Reki City was their best chance. But with their departure, the headquarters of the Eastern Church, the Violet family, and the Morton family all became empty as never before. Several invincible realm experts might realize this, but no one would care about it. After all the superpowers in the Dark World were gathered in Reki City at this time. Who had the time to pay attention to other places? As for Li Tianlan, perhaps they would never have thought that Li Tianlan would be so crazy. When the three invincible realm experts set off for Reki City, Li Tianlan also sent all the experts of the Snowdance Corps and led a small number of elites of the Snowdance Corps directly to their nest. Tonight, Li Tianlan did not leave any strength or leeway for himself. This was a completely hysterical and desperate attempt. If the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps stayed in Reki City, there might be a possibility of saving everything tonight, but it was just a possibility. Li Tianlan did not like possibilities. Victory was victory and defeat was defeat. Even if Li Tianlan was defeated tonight and died in Reki City, the Eastern Church, the Violet family and the Morton family would also be buried with him. Li Tianlan was not 100% sure whether he would win or not, but he was 100% sure that his opponent would not win. It seemed that since the Li family first appeared in Jianghu State hundreds of years ago, there had been an extremely crazy factor flowing in the blood of the Li family. This factor was called paranoia. The picture on the handheld computer finally paused. Ling Shuangxue, who had been silent most of the time, suddenly narrowed her eyes. The picture began to freeze. Then a voice sounded in the ears of Ling Shuangxue and Su Chang'e at the same time. In position. Ling Shuangxue took a deep breath and turned to look at her senior brother, who was also her husband. Her eyes were clear and the sword intent was soaring. Tonight they were carrying out the most difficult task, but they also brought the strongest elites. The intelligence system of the Samsara Palace was pervasive. But they didn't know much about the Violet family, which almost controlled the entire Snow Country. After an intelligence agent in the Samsara Palace, who had been close to the core of the Violet family, was killed in Northern Europe a few years ago, the Samsara Palace had less and less influence on the Violet family. Recently, several experts who had sneaked into the Violet family had not been put in an important position for the time being. Under such circumstances, they could only rely on Su Chang'e and Ling Shuangxue to investigate the Violet family by themselves. So as soon as they arrived in Eastern Europe, the two big shots of Jade Pool went straight to Snow City. Without the intelligence of the Samsara Palace, they had to investigate everything about the Violet family by themselves. The support that the Samsara Palace and the Qin clan gave them was also fair. The other high-level members of the Snowdance Corps took the elites of the Snowdance Corps to the Morton family. What they got was the intelligence of the Samsara Palace and the support of the internal personnel. And their actions in the Violet family couldn't be carried out with great fanfare. They had to erase all traces. Because this was Snow Country. And the Violet family was the real ruler of Snow Country. The current president of Snow Country was from the Violet family. Snow Country was not the most powerful country in the world. Their economy was extremely chaotic, but they were one of the most powerful military powers in the world. This country with the largest land area in the world was very poor, but it was overbearing and arrogant. So it could be said to be the most powerful country in the world. And the current president of Snow Country could also be said to be the most powerful and iron-blooded president in the history of Snow Country. The Snowdance Corps wanted to destroy the Violet family. But no one could find the evidence. So the elites who participated in this action tonight were all unfamiliar faces in the Dark World. They were extremely strange. They were extremely powerful. A total of 300 people. The super troops of the Lin clan. Xinyuan sword. In position. In position. In position. As the first voice sounded, countless voices responded at the same time. Su Chang'e's eyes had narrowed into slits. The roaring and raging sword energy in the mountains began to condense in an instant. The night, full of cold wind, was completely boiling. It was extremely abrupt, as if it had been prepared for a long time. Su Chang'e finally said, "Kill." His voice was like clear thunder. His voice reverberated in the air. In the next second, a deafening roar resounded throughout the entire snow city. The interior of the Violet family was instantly ignited with fire. An extreme explosion broke out from the center of the Violet Manor. The waves of fire rose into the sky with black smoke. The violent explosions were continuous and came from almost every corner of the Violet Manor. A large number of elites of the Violet family were swallowed by the fire. Their bodies exploded and their flesh and blood flew everywhere. In the fire, figures in black appeared one after another. Hundreds of people attacked at the same time and rushed over from all directions. Each of them wore an extremely strange silver mask on their heads. This was the first appearance of Shenyuan sword in the Dark World in nearly 20 years. There was no cold weapon that symbolized the identity of the super elites. Everyone wore a silver mask and held a silver gun in their hands. It was not a spear. It was a real gun that shone with silver light. The moment they rushed into the manor, every elite of Shenyuan sword pulled the trigger at the same time. There was no target, no aim. The shape of the silver gun was extremely strange and the muzzle was thick. As they fired, the thick muzzle spat out balls of light in an instant. The balls of light fell to the ground and dispersed like water. The next second, they directly turned into electric arcs flying everywhere. The moment the electric arcs appeared, all the brilliant lights in the manor went out in an instant. All the instruments stopped working, and the communication signal above the manor completely disappeared. Hundreds of phones fired by guns frantically spread to all corners. A sharp sound that was enough to pierce people's eardrums suddenly sounded with the spread of the electric arcs, filling the entire manor. In an instant, a large number of manor guards suddenly covered their ears and fell to the ground, howling. Blood gushed out of their ears, eyes, noses, and mouths. The sharp sound swept across the manor. Countless people fell down with twisted faces, and some even began to spit out white foam. More than half of the countless guards in the manor fell down at a speed visible to the naked eye. Countless electromagnetic fields were still spreading on the ground, and eventually became the shape of bubbles, constantly bursting. The sound in the manor became sharper and sharper. Pulse hand cannon. Code name, Armor Stripper. In the field of individual combat, this was the latest research result of the Lin clan. The powerful feature of pulse weapons was enough to destroy all signals on the battlefield in an instant, destroy human skills, and make people lose their combat effectiveness in an instant. Within the coverage of the armor-piercing hand cannon, elites below the fire-flaming realm would completely lose their combat effectiveness in an instant. Even those in the fire-flaming realm would have their strength greatly reduced. Only experts in the thunder-shocking realm could really be unaffected. But a large number of experts of the Violet family had gone to Reki City with the Violet family. How many experts in the fire-flaming realm and the thunder-shocking realm could there be in the manor today? The sharp buzzing soon passed. But the number of people who could stand on the ground in the manor had decreased by more than half. In the eyes of the elites of Shenyuan sword, who wore special masks, everyone who was still standing in the field had become the most conspicuous target. The sudden war was extremely strange. In the silence, the elites of Shenyuan sword rushed up like a pack of wolves. Fire and lightning bloomed at the same time. In an instant, they pierced through the three lines of defense of the Violet family and directly approached the center of the manor. Knowing this, in the luxurious villa in the center of the manor, a furious voice suddenly rang out. The voice was shrill and crazy, like a lion waving its sharp claws in vain after falling into a desperate situation. Who is it? Who dares to attack the Violet family? Damn it, you all deserve to die. Boom. The whole manor seemed to shake. With the lingering sound of anger, all the weapon defense systems in the Violet manor shook at the same time. But the electric arcs of the pulse weapons were still spreading in the manor. After a short shock, the defense system that the Violet family had spent a lot of money to build was less than one-third of the weapons that could be put into battle immediately. The battle broke out in an instant. The few elites left in the Violet family kept retreating under the attack of Shenyuan sword and fled in a panic. The few mists in the manor began to condense light. The next moment, the roar of countless cannons suddenly sounded, and the wild explosion completely shook the night sky. A little white light suddenly lit up in the quiet and deep night sky. The white light suddenly dispersed in the absolute condensation and turned into countless light spots that fell to the ground. Under the night sky, it seemed that a rain of light had suddenly fallen in the silent lights. But as the rain of light fell, countless sharp sword energy rose wildly into the sky in an instant. The white spot in the air gradually became clear. Vaguely, it seemed to be the figure of a woman. She stood high in the sky and danced in the face of the whole sky. She was cold and penetrating, but the sharp and chaotic sword intent was gathering crazily toward her. The sword energy flew and turned into light curtains standing in the air one after another. The dancing trajectory of the white figure became more and more chaotic and erratic. The rain of light was falling all over the sky. The sword energy rising from the ground rushed into the sky. The sword energy tore up the light spots, and there were drifting light spots everywhere between heaven and earth. The figure that kept dancing high in the sky waved her long sword, and the bright blade suddenly stabbed down. The wind blew. The clouds surged. The wind was biting cold and the night sky was rolling. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. The flying rain of light and the rising sword energy stopped at the same time and combined in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the sky and the earth formed a night curtain that almost covered the entire sky. It was gorgeous, beautiful, awe-inspiring, but with an indescribable solemnity. Anyone who practiced martial arts would be able to recognize this move. This was known as the most gorgeous and immortal sword move in the dark world. People entered the secular world. The sword came out of the world. Jade Pool in Jianghu State. Heavenly flying immortal. At the same time, Eastern Europe. The sharpness of Jianghu State's phantom sword and yin-yang sword exploded in the headquarters of the Morton family. Yun Qinshi, Han Chongyang, Hua Qingfeng, Li Zhonghu, and other high-level members of the Snowdance Corps directly launched a surprise attack on the Morton family as soon as they received a clear signal. Blood flowed like a river and there were cries everywhere. The entire Snowdance Corps seemed to have become extremely crazy under the leadership of Li Tianlan. The Violet family would not have expected that the Snowdance Corps would launch a surprise attack on them tonight. Neither would the Morton family. Most of the elites of the Snowdance Corps had to stay in the office of the president to imprison Wang Tianzong. In addition, the most powerful part of the Snowdance Corps was thrown to the Morton family by Li Tianlan. Even some high-level members of the Snowdance Corps did not know whether Li Tianlan was really confident or if he was completely crazy. However, the news from Reki City was obviously not optimistic. With the continuous loss of super high-end combat power, Li Tianlan was ready to take action in person. Ordinary elites might not understand what this meant. But every high-level member knew that Li Tianlan's action at this time meant that the situation was completely out of control. This was definitely enough to make people uneasy. On the extremely chaotic battlefield, when Li Wangxing once again pulled Li Zhonghu out of the desperate situation of certain death, the voice of the Lieutenant General of 9 regions, who had always been gentle and somewhat dull, was a little angry for the first time. "Old Li, what the hell are you doing?" Li Zhonghu shook his big head and said in a muffled voice, "Nothing." "Bullshit." Li Wangxing was a little flustered and exasperated. Tonight's surprise attack was perfect. The Morton family had insiders and their side had absolute strength suppression. The battle should have been easy. But at this time, Li Wangxing had several more wounds on his body. The command of the entire Snowdance Corps had become a little chaotic. It was completely different from when they marched from Im to Wulan State. Li Zhonghu, the commander, was even a little absent-minded. The battle had been dragging on. No wonder Li Wangxing was a little annoyed. "You call this okay? If I hadn't taken action, you would have died at least twice." Li Zhonghu frowned tightly. He suddenly glanced at Li Wangxing and asked, "Aren't you worried about His Highness?" Reki City was their main battlefield tonight. But now the situation in Reki City was out of control. With only 2 invincible realm experts on his side, Li Tianlan had to face King Tong and Paul of Rothschild, Hastile, Violet, and Lagos. No matter how he looked at it, such a move was equivalent to courting death. Li Zhonghu did not intend to think about it. But the more he did not want to think about it, the more he could not calm down. If Li Tianlan really died, what was the meaning of their so-called Snowdance Corps' existence? Li Wangxing was stunned for a moment. He took a deep look at Li Zhonghu and softened his tone. "Don't worry," he said calmly, "young master will be fine." The corners of Li Zhonghu's mouth twitched as if he were smiling. "Do you mean that His Highness will be fine facing 5 invincible realm experts, one of whom is Paul, who is close to the peak of the invincible realm?" "He'll be fine." The muscles at the corners of Li Wangxing's mouth twitched. He gritted his teeth and said, "Young master will definitely win." "How?" Li Zhonghu's voice suddenly rose for a moment, and then he lowered it again. "Why are you so sure?" Li Wangxing shook his head subconsciously, with a trace of confusion in his eyes. I don't know either. He shook his head, but his voice was still firm. But young master will definitely win. From the moment Wang Tianzong was imprisoned in the office of the president, we had already won. Because the situation that young master will face next is not important at all. His tone was a little stiff, as if he was comforting Li Zonghu, but also as if he was comforting himself. Who told you this? Li Zonghu narrowed his eyes and looked at Li Wangxing, his voice solemn. It's... Li Wangxing hesitated for a moment and said with a wry smile, It's Senior Li. Do you think Senior Li will hurt his grandson? Chapter 510. It was the night of August 17th. Reki City was in chaos. The whole of Eastern Europe was in turmoil. In the capital of Snow Country. In the Holy Gorian Church, Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, had been praying for nearly 4 hours. The thick Bible was turning slowly and gently in front of him. The light in the prayer room was dim. The compassionate and holy statue looked extremely majestic. In front of the statue, Patriarch Rock knelt humbly and looked extremely pious. The Holy Gorian Church was not the largest church in Snow Country. It was not even the largest church in the capital of Snow Country. However, Patriarch Rock, one of the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe, was stationed here. In the hearts of all the Eastern Church believers, the Holy Gorian Church could be said to be the most sacred place. Patriarch Rock's prayer and Patriarch Hastiel's action began almost at the same time. Patriarch Hastiel led the elites of the Eastern Church south into Reki City. Patriarch Rock was praying for the future of all of Eastern Europe. The Holy Gorian Church was heavily guarded. Countless elites of the Eastern Church surrounded the entire church motionlessly. The closer they got to the center of the church where the Patriarch prayed, the fewer people there were, but their strength was getting higher and higher. There were only 2 guards guarding near the prayer room. But they were all famous experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Church was indeed not as strong as the Vatican, which was famous all over the world, but no one dared to say that the Eastern Church was weak. The sphere of influence of the Eastern Church was mainly concentrated in the countries of Eastern Europe, and most of the believers were Eastern Church believers. For many years, even the Vatican had not been able to influence this place. This alone was enough to show the strength of the Eastern Church. There were no experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the Eastern Church, but in terms of foundation and comprehensive strength, at least in Eastern Europe, they could be completely fearless. His Highness Lawrence and our allies have a great advantage. According to the latest news, they have suppressed the Snowdance Corps in the Vatican. The whole process is very smooth. Your Excellency Bolet, congratulations. The 2 guards outside the prayer room stood quietly like sculptures. In the silent atmosphere, the older guard suddenly turned his head to look at his colleague and congratulated him with a smile. Bolet was a little thin. He wore the armor of the Eastern Church, and his entire face was hidden in the helmet, so it was unclear. But as the other party spoke, his eyes suddenly lit up with excitement. That excitement quickly calmed down. Bolet bowed respectfully and said softly, All of this is because of Captain Jiro's care and concern for me. Thank you, I will never forget everything you have done for me. Jiro's laughed with a happy and relaxed expression. He stretched out his hand and patted Bolet on the shoulder, saying softly, Now you should consider who you want to take to Reki City. Of course, if you don't have a suitable candidate, I can recommend someone for you. Under the helmet, Beauregard lowered his head and said calmly, Thank you very much, leader. Jiro smiled and narrowed his eyes. The look in his eyes became more and more satisfied. The Eastern Church also had something similar to the Holy Disarmament Corps. In the establishment of the Eastern Church, such a department was called the Knights of Light. There were 4 patriarchs in the Eastern Church. The Honorable Marshal Banner of Knights had 4 commanders. Captain Jiros was the commander of the knights who served Patriarch Rock. He controlled a quarter of the power of the Knights of Light, and Bolet was his most important deputy. Among the 4 patriarchs, Rock and Patriarch Hastiel had a very good personal relationship. Before this action, the 2 patriarchs had reached a consensus. In the Battle of Reki City tonight, if the Eastern Church could suppress the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, the Eastern Church would establish a branch of the Knights of Light in Wulon State in an extremely strong manner, which could also be said to be a subordinate agency. For example, the relationship between Knights Templars and the Vatican. The new agency was called the Knights of Light, composed of elites led by Rock and Patriarch Hastiel, and a small number of elite warriors of the other two patriarchs. Deputy Commander Bolet was the commander of the Knights of Light that both Rock and Patriarch Hastile thought highly of. The geographical location of Wulan State was extremely sensitive and special. If the Knights of Light were established, they would shoulder a very important mission from the moment of its establishment. Reki City was the main road between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and the military would fight for it. Tonight, if Patriarch Hastile could expel the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps, once the Knights of Light were established, Bolet would become one of the most important figures in the entire Eastern Church. His status was no less than that of the four commanders of the Holy Punishment Knights or even higher. Because everyone knew that the Eastern Church's ambition was more than that. The Dark World had been too calm before, and the Vatican had been too strong, so the Eastern Church could only stay dormant in Eastern Europe. But tonight the Eastern Church and Rothschild had joined forces, and the Violet and Morton families had joined in. As long as they could win tonight, the Qing clan and Rekvia in Eastern Europe would inevitably suffer heavy losses. The Snowdance Corps would also withdraw from Eastern Europe in embarrassment, and the strength of the Vatican would also be greatly damaged. Even if Arcis was lucky enough to survive, there was no need for Paul, who had exposed his strength, to continue to hide. At that time, the Knights of Light would use Wulan State as the foundation, unite Rothschild and the wealthy families of Eastern Europe, and march westward at the same time to take down the Vatican. That was a game that was destined to be magnificent. As long as they thought about it, everyone in the Eastern Church could feel their blood boiling. There was a flash of complacency in Jiros's distant and deep eyes. No matter what the final outcome of this game was, as long as the Knights of Light could be established in Wulan State, he would become the most powerful of the four knight commanders. Because Bolet was his man. A cold wind suddenly blew through the deep courtyard of the church. The cold wind blew into the prayer room, and the lights flickered for a moment. In the prayer room, the slight sound of pages turning stopped. The change was very small. Jiros didn't care. A cell phone suddenly rang. Jiros glanced down at the screen and answered the call. What? The person on the other side of the phone just reported, but Jiros suddenly exclaimed. His face changed dramatically and he didn't come to his senses for a while. After a long time he took a deep breath, suddenly turned around and strode to the prayer room. Chief Knight, Bolet shouted subconsciously. I want to see the Patriarch. I have something very important to report. He pushed open the door of the prayer room. The lights were dim. The Patriarch knelt there facing the statue. The Bible was open but the pages were not turning. Jiros's heart was in a mess. But he still suppressed the anger in his heart and slowly said, Patriarch, I'm sorry to disturb your prayer, but I have something very important to report to you. The Patriarch knelt there motionless. Patriarch. Jiros called again. The Patriarch's head seemed to have lost its support and slowly drooped. Jiros's heart suddenly sank to the bottom. He suddenly took a step forward and rushed directly to the Patriarch's side. Everything in his line of sight caused his eyes to become completely lifeless. The Patriarch closed his eyes. Blood was slowly flowing out of his chest. The dark red color soaked the red robe, which looked extremely strange. There was a dagger in his heart. A fatal stab. Jiros suddenly felt that it was extremely absurd. He couldn't even believe what he saw. Another cool breeze blew in his face. The wind was very soft. But the faint killing intent suddenly became extremely condensed. A subtle, almost invisible lightning was blooming and spreading, light and swift. Jiros suddenly came back to his senses and was instantly furious. Countless lightning bolts surged on his body for a moment. Damn it, whoosh! A huge force surged directly from behind Jiros before he could make a sound. Behind him, Bolet, whom he had always trusted, suddenly stretched out his hand and firmly controlled his body. This kind of control lasted for a moment. But a moment was enough. A gentle but cold breeze blew into the lightning around his body. A cold but perfect palm appeared in the dim light. The luster of the dagger flashed in his sight. The palm swept past his neck. The blade of the dagger tore Jiros's throat in an instant. Warm blood suddenly splashed out and gushed out like a fountain. Jiros's eyes widened. Feeling the blood gushing out of the gap in his body, he suddenly understood the cause of the Patriarch's death. It was impossible for someone to hide here in advance and kill Patriarch Rock. It was even more impossible for someone to sneak into the heavily guarded church. The only possibility was that the killer was carefully brought in and arranged here. It wouldn't be long. It happened half an hour ago at most. And half an hour ago he happened to leave once. Jiros gritted his teeth and turned his head. Blood spurted out of his neck. He opened his mouth but he couldn't make a sound. Bolet, who had suppressed him for a moment at the critical moment, was looking at him quietly. There was no pleasure, helplessness, guilt, or complacency in his eyes. His eyes were calm. It could even be said that he was very devout. Bolet seemed to see what Jiros wanted to ask. He drew a cross on his chest seriously and said calmly, "Have you heard of the Protestant Church?" Bang. Jiros's pupils dilated for a moment. His body fell to the ground and he died with his eyes open. The wind hidden behind the statue blew over and quickly disappeared in the prayer room. The breeze was invisible. It was invisible and silent. It was silent. The duties of the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church were extremely clear. Patriarch Hastile, who was ranked on the divine list and could be said to be the top expert in Eastern Europe, was responsible for fighting. Patriarch Rock, who was the most low-key and devout, was responsible for consolidating the believers' faith. Patriarch Calendar was the most high-profile. He was also the patriarch that everyone in Eastern Europe was most familiar with. He was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church. Patriarch Marika was the most mysterious and was responsible for preaching. They were the 4 patriarchs of Eastern Europe. In the list of heresies of the Vatican, the importance of the 4 patriarchs could be said to be second only to Raphael, the leader of the Dark Knights. They were also the 4 most famous heresies in the heart of the Vatican. The strongest Hastile was defined as a killer by the Vatican. He was responsible for all the fighting affairs of the Eastern Church, and he was indeed the patriarch with the most blood on his hands. Rock, who was the most low-key but responsible for the core believers' faith, was defined as a controller. His brainwashing work was extremely successful even in the eyes of the Vatican. Countless fanatics were the biggest obstacle to the Vatican's conquest of Eastern Europe. Calendar, who was responsible for the internal and external affairs of the Eastern Church, was defined as a destroyer. The Vatican had never given up on Eastern Europe, but every time it infiltrated, it was eventually destroyed by Calendar. To some extent, he was a big heretic that the Vatican hoped to get rid of the most. Marika, who was responsible for preaching, was defined as a conspirator by the Vatican. In the field of religion, the preaching of the Eastern Church was equivalent to a war in the eyes of the Vatican. Such preaching was not simply about spreading faith. Specifically, how to weaken the strength of the Vatican. Developing his own believers was Marika's field of work. Tonight, when the battle in Reki City broke out, Patriarch Marika was holding an extremely mysterious meeting in a small city in the south of Wulan State. Marika did not think that Hastile would lose. He firmly believed that Wulan State would become an area controlled by the Eastern Church before the sun rose tomorrow. So in order to set off a religious war in the shortest time, the Patriarch summoned his 6 godsons at once. Without exception, all 6 godsons came from Europe, but not from Eastern Europe. France, England, Italos, the empire where the sun never sets, and Germany. 5 godsons came from these 5 countries, and they were all leaders of a certain wealthy family in their respective countries. And the last godson came from the Vatican. This was Marika's proudest achievement in recent years. After the Eastern Church occupied Reki City, the Morton family, the Violet family, and Rothschild would go all out to cooperate with them and spread the war of faith to the whole of Europe. These 6 godsons from Europe naturally had their own missions, and they were all extraordinary missions. He was a conspirator in the eyes of the Vatican, and he was best at conspiring. The meeting lasted for nearly 3 hours. Marika almost detailed every step of the operation. After confirming that there was no mistake, he ended the meeting. The 6 godsons left one after another. Patriarch Marika waited for a while before slowly walking out of the conference room. The venue of the meeting was not any secret place in the Eastern Church, but the only 5-star hotel in the city. 4 knights stood neatly outside the room. Among them, Knight Tang Minger, one of the 4 commanders of the Knights of Light, was also there. Seeing Patriarch Marika walk out of the room, Knight Tang Minger bowed slightly. "Let's go back." Patriarch Marika smiled faintly. His voice was soft and magnetic, carrying an extremely powerful appeal. Tang Minger nodded and led the way, while the other 3 knights followed behind. The night was getting darker. It was quiet in the corridor of the hotel. In the warm light, light footsteps sounded. A tall woman walked over. Her skin was fair, but it was not the kind of white that Europeans had. She looked like a Eurasian, and her golden hair swayed gently as she walked. The woman's pace was very lazy, but it was extremely enchanting. Tang Minger looked at the woman's gently twisting body, and his eyes flashed with passion. The woman's appearance could not be regarded as a character, but she was very charming, and her every move was very seductive. Tang Minger's eyes were a little hot. In such a serious scene tonight, he suddenly thought of a few Eastern European noble ladies with whom he maintained a private relationship. Tang Minger shook his head in self-mockery, suppressed his inner desire, and glanced at the woman opposite him. Before the feeling of pity in his heart had subsided, a huge shock had already arisen. In his line of sight, the very elegant and feminine girl suddenly stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened and she looked behind them with a face full of horror. Tang Minger instinctively sensed that something was wrong. Suddenly a strange sound rang out from behind. The four knights turned around at the same time. A woman in a hotel uniform pushed a dining cart over, and her speed kept increasing. "Kill her!" Tang Minger suddenly shouted and rushed to the dining cart without hesitation. The three knights beside him followed him instinctively. "Go!" a weak voice suddenly sounded. But this voice sounded like thunder in Tang Minger's ears. It was the voice of Patriarch Marika. However, the voice stopped abruptly. Tang Minger suddenly turned around. In his sight, the woman who had covered her mouth with a frightened face put down her hand. A steel needle fell out of his sleeve. His palm was slender but extremely thick. It was clearly a man's palm. A thought flashed across Tang Minger's mind. Before he could move, the assassin who was dressed as a woman but looked so lifelike had already gotten close to Marika. The steel needle in his hand pierced through Marika's heart without hesitation. Countless electric arcs burst out in front of Marika's chest. They passed through his back and swept toward Tang Minger with a large amount of blood. Tang Minger pressed the alarm button in his hand and moved forward without hesitation. A shining tip of a sword pierced through his body from behind. The three knights beside the dining cart had already fallen. The woman in the uniform of a waiter held a long sword and pierced his heart. The assassin who killed Patriarch Marika took off his wig, mask and women's clothes. The chaotic footsteps sounded. Countless knights of the Eastern Church rushed over. But he had completed the task and didn't care at all. Tang Minger slowly fell down. A second before his life ended, he heard a voice. "Your Highness Li Tianlan sends his regards to the Eastern Church." The drifting clouds were formless. Fearless and fearless. Free and unrestrained. The ruins in front of the Caesar Hotel had completely disappeared. Everything in the surroundings had been completely erased from the intense battle. The originally bustling street was empty. The world was dead silent. The wreckage of the corpses was scattered everywhere. The blood spread into a river and flowed under their feet. The rain was still falling. On the ground, the blood-colored ripples kept spreading, which looked vivid and strange. Arcis, an expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican, was already covered in blood. He sat alone in the corpse-strewn battlefield, panting heavily. In this spacious and silent world, his panting was extremely ear-piercing, sounding extremely gloomy. In his sight, everyone had fallen down and turned into corpses. Only he was still alive. In the empty city. A lonely person. In the distant sky. It was raining wildly. Arcis gasped and was in a daze. At this moment he suddenly felt extremely lonely, as if he was standing at the highest point of the world. His whole body seemed to be filled with a kind of loneliness from the inside out. Arcis sat on the ground, took out a cigarette and lit it. For a moment he was at a loss. Everything that happened tonight could be said to be the fiercest battle he had ever encountered in his life. But when the battle was over and the result was clear, what he felt was not joy but confusion. King Tong's body fell in front of him. The blood covered her enchanting blonde hair, which looked extremely dirty. Beside King Tong, Paul, who only had a head left, died with his eyes open, but there was no sound. Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, who had always been regarded as the biggest heretic by the Vatican, had his heart pierced by a sword. The murderous weapon, Dark Saint's Spear, which was famous in the Dark World, was in his hand at this time. The body of the master of Samsara Palace lay there in the distance, a little blurred. Arcis had always been curious about the master of Samsara Palace. But now that the battle was over, he suddenly didn't want to take a look at her. Situ Tsangyue died beside the master of Samsara Palace. And in front of the Lord of Sai City, Tribulation's body was split in half. The famous sword was still sharp. But Qin Shilai had become flesh and blood all over the sky. Countless corpses spread out from under Aracis's feet. Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club. Mitchell. Cass Rotter. Juan Kong. Melat. Violet, Lagos and Hastile. All the invincible realm experts who could be named had turned into corpses. A little farther away, Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan, also lay there quietly without a sound. Arceus suddenly laughed. Everything tonight broke out in chaos and abruptness. In the battlefield of the Caesar Hotel, their side had an absolute advantage, and his arrival made the victory completely tilted to their side. Without any hesitation, Arceus did his best to attack as soon as he arrived. He killed Paul in the shortest time, and then killed the invincible realm experts of the Violet family and the Morton family. The heretic Hastile, who was known as the Slaughterer in the eyes of the Vatican, surrendered to his power. And the Heroes Club, Fantasy World, the Men in Black and even the Snowdance Corps were all badly injured. After the coronation, Arceus, who was at the peak of his strength, did not hesitate to cooperate with the Snowdance Corps and kill Charlemagne, the president of the Heroes Club. Cass Rotter and Huan Kong also died under his absolute power. When only the Snowdance Corps was left on the battlefield, it was hard to say who would make the first move. The battle broke out without warning. In the end, Arceus killed all the strong enemies including Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan. His strength completely transformed in the high-intensity battle and went further from the peak of the invincible realm. Now he was still in the state of coronation. He had surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. In the state of coronation he almost dared to fight with the real Chosen One. His current strength had even surpassed that of Pope Monlier, who was known as the greatest in hundreds of years. Arceus laughed maniacally. This is my dark world. I am the king of the dark world. The only king. Ah. The crazy laughter kept echoing. Near Arceus, a middle-aged man in a red robe quietly watched Arceus go crazy. There was undisguised mockery in his eyes. This was a middle-aged man about 50 years old. His handsome face was pale at this time, but his eyes were still calm. He quietly looked at Arceus, who was in a state of madness. His eyes were calm and motionless like a statue. You should rest in your residence in the middle of the night. You shouldn't come here. A voice suddenly sounded and fell into the ears of the middle-aged man. It also fell into Arceus's ears. The extremely silent world was instantly filled with this voice. I shouldn't come here, come here, here? The echo was mighty and kept echoing between heaven and earth. Arceus's face suddenly changed. He suddenly looked up at the sky and said angrily, Who is it? I've been looking for you for a long time. A hand fell on the middle-aged man's shoulder. A white figure seemed to come out of nothingness and stood beside the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's face suddenly changed. Under the agitation of his emotions, he couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Puff! In Arceus's sight, heaven and earth suddenly shook. A bloody wind whistled past, and a rain of blood suddenly floated between heaven and earth. Arceus was stunned and his eyes were a little blank. You, the middle-aged man stared at the white figure in front of him. He was very familiar with the dark world. So he had identified the other party's identity when he came out of nothingness without any power fluctuation. This was not the other party's martial arts. There was only one piece of clothing in the dark world that could have such a weird hiding ability. The Azure Dragon armor of Jianghu State. Naturally, there was only one person who could wear this suit. Azure Dragon of Jianghu State. Gong Sunqi. Are you playing a monkey here? Gong Sunqi looked at the middle-aged man in front of him. Are you Patriarch Calendar? What do you want? Calendar, whose face was pale, said slowly. His mind, which had been tense all this while, was completely shattered. At the same time, the world in front of Arceus turned upside down. The rain of blood disappeared. All the corpses also disappeared. The whole world was filled with the sound of wind and rain. The scene was empty and calm. Not far away, the roar caused by the fierce battle was faintly discernible. The battle did not stop. Arceus was a little confused. I don't want anything. Gong Sunqi said blandly, Jianghu State says hello to you. He waved his hand. Bang. Calendar, who had exhausted all his physical strength, directly exploded into a cloud of blood mist. Gong Sunqi watched the blood mist drift away expressionlessly. He suddenly looked up at Arceus and asked curiously, after the Pope's coronation, can you also be hypnotized? The corner of Arceus's mouth twitched, and his eyes became ashamed and furious in an instant. It was not until this moment that he realized what had happened. But this should not have happened at all. After the Pope's coronation, his will should have been extremely focused. But how could he be hypnotized by Calendar tonight and fall into his trap? Arceus looked around. The corpses around him disappeared. But everything around him was indeed extremely empty. All the buildings around him were completely razed to the ground by the tremendous force. There was no doubt that this was Arsis's masterpiece. In the state of hypnosis, all the enemies in front of Arsis were really strong. The fierce battle made him squander his strength without reservation. But in fact, he had been standing here by himself, showing his strength at the peak of the invincible realm to the air and the surrounding buildings. When the absurd emotions rose, all Arsis could feel was awkwardness. How is this possible? He didn't know why he was hypnotized in the state of coronation. But at this time he could clearly understand his state. In the illusion of hypnosis, all the enemies he met were really strong. After waking up from the confusion of squandering his power, Arsis's physical strength and willpower had fallen to the lowest point. At this moment, Arsis could even feel that the concentrated will of the Pope's coronation began to slowly decline. His peak period had been wasted by Calendar in the hypnosis. How was this possible? A mouthful of blood spurted out of Arsis's mouth. The blood on the corners of his mouth in anger directly affected his excessive injury, and Arsis's momentum suddenly dropped a lot. Gong Sun Chi's heart sank a lot. Arsis, who had almost no combat power in this state, was not at the peak of the invincible realm. Damn it! Arsis suddenly clenched his fists and growled, "The heretics of the Eastern Church deserve to die." There is another patriarch of the Eastern Church on the battlefield less than 5 kilometers away from here. Gong Sun Chi's voice was complicated. But in your current state, what can you do? Chapter 511. The emotions in Gong Sun Chi's tone were so complicated and tangled. Arsis could clearly hear the complexity in his words. It was contempt, disappointment, and disbelief. It was a lot of emotions that Arsis had never felt before. Almost in an instant, Arsis completely calmed down. Everything was a little abnormal tonight. Among the 4 patriarchs of the Eastern Church, Patriarch Rock, the most low-key and pious controller, had profound attainments in the spiritual field. But now it seemed that Patriarch Calendar, the Destroyer, was no worse than Patriarch Rock in the spiritual field. This was a spiritual attainment close to the transcendent realm. If it got out, it would be enough to cause a stir in the dark world. Arsis had no time to think about these questions. The only thing he wanted to know was how he was hypnotized. He had been crowned by the Pope, and his spiritual will was flawless. The greatly improved willpower also made him more focused on using his power, so that his strength could leap again on the basis of the peak of the invincible realm. Strictly speaking, he could not be hypnotized after the Pope was crowned. It was impossible for Calendar to do this in any case. But in fact, the most impossible thing had happened. He had fought endlessly in the illusion set up by Calendar, wasted all his physical strength, and was even seriously injured. In the illusion he was invincible and stood at the peak of the world. But Gong Sun Chi pulled him back to the cruelest and coldest reality. The street was empty and calm. The buildings destroyed by Arsis's great power turned into ruins and piled up on the ground. The roar of the battle in the distance was endless. Feeling the sense of weakness and powerlessness coming from all over his body, Arsis's face was ugly and cold. "How's the situation?" he asked suddenly. If Rothschild was destroyed tonight, many stories were bound to happen. But now Rothschild was still there. And Arsis had been trapped here for an unknown period of time. Under such circumstances, the Vatican and the Snowdance Corps were naturally still allies. "We lost," Gong Sun Chi said calmly. "In the battle tonight, the biggest accident was naturally that Paul exposed his strength that was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm. It was also an accident that Arsis, who was crowned by the Pope, was hypnotized by Patriarch Calendar." Gong Sun Chi saw very clearly that Arsis had clearly fallen into an illusion and could not extricate himself. If he had not come, this block could be regarded as the spiritual world of Patriarch Callan. If he had come a little later, Arsis would have been at risk of dying. The suppression in the spiritual realm was far more tragic than that of martial arts. Arsis could not distinguish between illusion and reality. In the end, he could only fall in the illusion with an unparalleled sense of accomplishment. The Patriarch of Eastern Europe was almost lucky enough to kill the expert at the peak of the invincible realm of the Vatican that night. What did this mean? Gong Sun Chi knew very well that there was definitely something wrong with it. But the question was no longer important. The most important thing was that Arsis couldn't appear on the battlefield immediately, so the entire battle began to tilt in favor of Rothschild. Lost? Arsis raised his thick eyebrows and roared in a low voice, "But the battle is not over yet. Does it matter? Mitchell, Huan Kong and Cass Rotter have all died. Qin Shilai and Tribulation have also been seriously injured and left the battlefield. Now on that battlefield, Violet, Lagos and Hastile have teamed up with King Tong Paul to kill the elites of several major forces. The battle is indeed not over yet. That's because the army of Wulan State has not been killed. What about you? What can you do in your current state?" Arisis's face was pale. Every time Gong Sun Chi said a word, his heart sank a little. By the time Gong Sun Chi finished speaking, the Saint War Angel of the Vatican's heart had sunk to the bottom. In any case, he did not expect that the situation of this war had become so serious. The Snowdance Corps and Wulan State will make their last efforts. But if the general trend is really irresistible at the last moment, Zhongzhou State can only choose to give up Wulan State. As for the Vatican, Gong Sun Chi's eyes were cold and indifferent. "Take care of yourself." The night wind blew over. Arsis suddenly felt a chill all over his body. But after all, he did not completely lose the ability to think. Gong Sun Chi's few words had already painted a picture of the battlefield and the future for him. "You mean Violet, Morton, and the Eastern Church are joining hands with Rothschild?" Gong Sun Chi did not speak and turned around expressionlessly. Arisis's eyes turned cold. At this moment he did not think of Gong Sun Chi's rudeness, but the consequences if he lost the war tonight. The Snowdance Corps occupied Wulan State. Such a great advantage made Li Tianlan directly trigger the war tonight. Therefore the Snowdance Corps could not afford to lose. Li Tianlan and the Li family could not afford to lose. Once they lost the war tonight, Li Tianlan and the Li family would be under tremendous pressure. But in the current situation, the Vatican could not afford to lose either. Rothschild, the Eastern Church, Violet and Morton. Once the four of them occupied Wulan State together and took advantage of Wulan State to move westward, the elites of the entire Eastern Church could directly attack the Holy Land. The cooperation of the four forces could be said to be flawless. Rothschild could provide an incomparable foundation in Western Europe, and Paul was an absolute master who could restrain Arsis. The identity of the Eastern Church could always limit this invasion to the scope of a religious war, and it could also use the doctrines of the Eastern Church to influence the believers of the Vatican. The doctrines from the same Bible, even if there were differences, how big could they be? The Morton family could provide absolute wealth. Violet could use the unlimited political resources of Snow Country as a bargaining chip. It was not that the Vatican could not withstand such a lineup. But the significance of this matter did not lie in whether the Vatican could withstand it or not. For the Vatican, as long as the Eastern Church stepped into Western Europe, every time they developed a believer, it was a failure of the Vatican. At that time, the mystery of the Vatican and the majesty of the Saint War Angel would become a joke. Arsis hated it when someone made fun of him. Although he became a joke tonight, only Gong Sun Chi could see it. If the Vatican failed tonight, his joke would be seen by the whole world. Arisis's eyes became colder and colder. "Do you look down on me?" he asked suddenly. Gong Sun Chi's figure was about to disappear under the cover of the azure dragon armor. Hearing this, his figure paused slightly and turned around again. "What you did tonight is not worthy of respect." Gong Sun Chi said calmly, "At least as an ally, I can't understand." Arsis nodded. His expression was serious and calm. "This is an accident, but everything can be reversed." A crimson pill appeared in his hand. The pill was dark and scarlet, looking extremely strange. Without any hesitation, Arsis swallowed the pill. The red pill melted in his mouth, and then it was like a fire that suddenly burned. The burning feeling flowed down his throat and burned his whole body. Arisis's body trembled violently, as if he was suffering great pain. His pale face turned ruddy in an instant, and an unparalleled violent momentum burst out. The domain of the peak of the invincible realm began to condense toward him. In an instant, a gust of wind was set off on the empty street. Gong Sun Chi stood on the edge of the domain. He was the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm under the invincible realm, and he had the strongest combat capability of the invincible realm. Even if Li Tianlan rose, Gong Sun Chi was still the strongest under the invincible realm. But the strongest superior of the half-step invincible realm couldn't help but shake under the fluctuation of this domain, and he seemed to be a little unstable. Arsis closed his eyes and endured the pain in his body that almost tore his soul apart. The extremely violent effect lasted for about 10 minutes. Arsis slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were calm and his aura was completely calm. "Let's go." Arsis glanced at Gong Sun Chi. "Let's go and have a look." This is... Gong Sun Chi opened his mouth but he didn't finish his words. In the dark world, there were many gene potions that could support experts to fight in various environments. Among them, there were many magical drugs that could temporarily restore the combat capability of seriously injured people. In many cases this often meant another extra life. But such drugs were often only suitable for those below the invincible realm. There were very few drugs that could make an invincible realm expert recover from his injury and return to the peak state in an instant, and they were often accompanied by various sequelae, such as blurred willpower, confusion of friends and foes, and the more serious ones might even lower the realm. But the red pill in Arisis's hand obviously had no restrictions. He who had returned to the peak state in an instant, could distinguish between friends and foes. In such a situation he dared to take the pill, which even showed that he didn't need to pay too much later. Such a drug should be a treasure even in the Wang family of Beihai, which had the most powerful gene potion technology. The Vatican's research in this regard was not as good as that of the Wang family of Beihai, and compared with other developed countries, it had no advantage. What kind of drug was this? This is the latest achievement of the Vatican. There is only one of it and it's with me. The muscles at the corners of Arisis's mouth twitched. This red pill was naturally not as good as the Immortality potion, but it could make a seriously injured expert at the peak of the invincible realm return to the peak combat capability in an instant, which was enough to show how powerful it was. The code name of this medicine, Redemption, could be said to be the highest achievement of the Vatican in this regard. This was originally one of Arisis's trump cards. In his plan, this should have been the trump card to face Wang Tianzong in the final decisive battle in the chaos of Eastern Europe. But now, because of the Eastern Church, this redemption was wasted here. Because he couldn't afford to lose. Tonight, it was even more impossible for him to withdraw from Wulan state and let the Eastern Church enter Western Europe to touch the Holy Land. These heretics really deserved to die. Arsis narrowed his eyes, and there was infinite killing intent in them. At this moment he did not deliberately show his strength, but he stood there, and he was already indomitable. Gong Sun Chi took a deep look at Arsis. After a long time, he bowed slightly and said, "Gong Sun Chi pays respect to your highness." Arsis did not speak. The suffocating sense of oppression in the field was still there. However, his figure had already disappeared. Gong Sun Chi stood up and looked at the sky. In the night, a violent and ostentatious killing intent roared and surged all the way away. Gong Sun Chi was silent for a long time before he slowly turned around. A gentle and quiet voice suddenly sounded behind him without warning. The voice was very, very close behind Gong Sun Chi. "Third brother? Did you kill Calland?" Gong Sun Chi's face changed dramatically and he suddenly turned around. The surprise attack of freezing Snow City was like a real war. After the fighting, the explosion, and the flying blood fell, the sword light retracted, and the vast manor returned to peace. The war broke out abruptly. It also ended abruptly. In the Battle of Reki City, Violet took away more than 60% of the elite forces of the Violet family. In order to maintain the stability of Snow City, some of the experts in the manor were scattered all over the city. The most important thing was that the departure of Violet himself made the Violet family lose its most powerful deterrent. Under such circumstances, the sharpness of the Shenyuan sword troop was almost completely released from the very beginning. The pulse weapons cleared the field as soon as possible, and the remaining experts were few after the first charge of the Shenyuan sword troop. The heavenly fairy of Ling Shuangxue, the first elder of Jade Pool, blocked the counterattack of the fog defense system of the Violet family's headquarters. This was just the beginning. As soon as an expert of the half-step invincible realm and an expert at the peak of the thundershocking realm of the Violet family appeared, a sword strike that was more ruthless and decisive than the heavenly fairy had already broken out inside the manor. The famous sword snow-blowing, heaven-shattering rainbow. With just one sword strike, the two strongest experts of the Violet family who stayed at the headquarters tonight had been smashed into pieces. From the attack to the patriarch of the Violet family, the raid of Shenyuan sword took less than half an hour from beginning to end. On this night, the most important figures of the supreme Violet family in Snow Country were all exposed to the sharpness of the Jade Pool. Without any defensive measures when facing death, the rich and powerful families were also trembling with fear. The blood beads on the snow-blowing flowed down and dripped on the expensive carpet. Su Chang'e, who had only made one sword strike in the whole war, quietly looked at the crowd crawling at his feet. The patriarch of the Violet family, Tovo Granoski Violet, and all the important figures of the Violet family in the headquarters. The old patriarch of the Violet family, who was paralyzed in bed at the age of 80. Tovo's 2 younger sisters. An elder brother. In addition, there were a few children who looked no more than 5 or 6 years old. At this moment, all the members of the Violet family were huddled together, looking at Su Chang'e with undisguised fear and hatred in their eyes. Mr. Su. A captain of the Xinyuan sword troop came over and said expressionlessly, "I've checked. In addition to the Violet family, there are 8 other members of the Violet family who are not here. They are all very important figures and 2 of them are in Snow City. Send someone to kill them," Su Chang'e said in a flat tone. The captain nodded, turned around and went to deploy. Su Chang'e's eyes fell on Tovo, the patriarch of the Violet family. He was silent for a while before he said calmly, "So, in tonight's raid, we actually only captured you, the most valuable hostage? There's nothing we can't talk about." Tovo took a deep breath. He was still in his pajamas. When the Xinyuan sword troops raided the manor, he happened to take off the clothes of a young female counselor who had recently been trained to be very obedient. He waved his hand, stood up tentatively and said slowly and sincerely, "People of China, the Violet family is very willing to be friends with you. We can talk, we can talk. I can call my wife now. She will come back with the elites of the family. No, she can even help you. You want to deal with Rothschild? Violet can help you." A member of the Xinyuan sword army came over, took a photo and then retreated. "You can't kill me. It will destroy the relationship between Snow Country and Zhongzhou State. If we cooperate, all of Eastern Europe will be ours. Your young marshal has great power. He is a strong man. I'm willing to share Eastern Europe with the strong. Time will prove that cooperating with the Violet family is the best choice." Su Chang'e glanced at the elite who had just retreated. The other side nodded expressionlessly. Su Chang'e also nodded and glanced at Tovo. "Are you done?" Tovo's pupils shrank sharply. "Time will prove that killing you tonight is the best choice," Su Chang'e said calmly. The snow-blowing sword made a very bright arc of light in the air. The arc of light flashed and then disappeared. A few drops of blood splashed out. A line of blood suddenly bloomed on Tovo's throat. The blood spurted out, looking strange and bloody. What right does a patriarch who is willing to hand over the power of the family to a woman have to talk about cooperation? Su Chang'e said indifferently. There was a sudden exclamation in the gorgeous hall. The rest of the old people, children and women all huddled together, shivering. Su Chang'e glanced at them. "Senior brother, what should we do with these people?" Ling Shuangxue came over and asked. Su Chang'e's eyes shifted from the children to the old people. There was a touch of hesitation in his eyes. "I can't get in touch with His Highness now," he said slowly. "Maybe these people can be used to threaten Violet." Ling Shuangxue did not speak. There were indeed 2 children born to Tovo and Violet, a boy and a girl. The boy was close to adulthood, and the girl was only 5 years old this year. It was a good choice to use to threaten Violet. But Li Tianlan didn't seem to think about this problem from the beginning. His order was very simple, that was, to destroy the entire Violet family. No matter who won or lost the battle in Reki City tonight, the Violet family and the Morton family were bound to disappear in Eastern Europe. If the Snowdance Corps won, the Qin clan and Rekvia would get more and greater benefits in Eastern Europe in the future. Su Chang'e looked at the group of old, young women and children in front of him, and his eyes were a little shaken. He saw cowardice, fear and hatred in their eyes. After all, he was just a swordsman who lived in Jade Pool and rarely went down the mountain. Now he had destroyed the Violet family, but in the face of this group of old, young women and children who had no power to fight back, he was at a loss for a moment. The elites of Xinyuan Sword slowly walked into the hall. They were also looking at this group of people who had no power to fight back, their eyes cold and silent. Su Chang'e suddenly felt a little sick. He shook his head hard and said, "I'll make a phone call." "Can't you get in touch with His Highness?" Ling Shuangxue asked. Su Chang'e shook his head. "I'll call Rushi. Maybe His Highness has other arrangements." The phone was quickly connected. Dongqing Rushi's clear voice sounded very soft. "Master?" Su Chang'e's inner struggle gradually calmed down. He smiled and said gently, "It's me." Dongqing Rushi said honestly, "Tianlan is not here. How are things on your side?" "Everything is going well." Su Chang'e looked back at the crowded hostages, sighed softly and said, "I still have some old people and children of the Violet family in my hands. They are all very important people. Rushi, does His Highness have any other arrangements?" Dongqing Rushi also fell silent. Obviously, she also understood the meaning of this sentence. Su Chang'e quietly waited for Dongqing Rushi's answer. They are all enemies. After a long time, Dongqing Rushi said softly. But these are old people and children. Su Chang'e subconsciously raised his voice. The youngest child is less than 2 years old this year. After all, he couldn't accept what might happen next, so he directly expressed his position. Dongqing Rushi was silent. There was silence on the other end of the phone. After a long time in the silence, Dongqing Rushi hung up the phone. She didn't respond to Su Chang'e's words in the end. No response was actually a kind of response. Su Chang'e's body was a little cold. He stood there for a long time, then glanced at Ling Shuangxue and said in a low voice, "Let's go." The 2 swordsmen of Mount Shu slowly walked out. The elites of the Xianyuan sword troops stood quietly. The temperature in the hall became gloomy and cold. The door slowly closed. A child's cry suddenly sounded in the room. Sword intent spread out in the hall. The screams lasted for a moment and then disappeared. Su Chang'e didn't look back. He stepped on the flagstone road of the manor. Wherever he walked, a line of deep footprints was branded on the flagstone road, deep and clear. Senior brother? Ling Shuangxue hesitated. Su Chang'e slowly shook his head and suddenly said, "Let's go back." Ling Shuangxue was a little confused. She opened her charming and extremely moving eyes wide. "Go back to Jianghu State," Su Chang'e said in a low voice. He straightened his body and subconsciously looked in the direction of Reki City. In Reki City, Dongqing Rushi stood in front of the window and looked at the extremely deep night outside. The screen of the phone that hung up completely dimmed. The wind and rain were messy. She stood quietly. In the distant sky, the deep night seemed to turn into an extremely dark shadow. The shadow slowly drifted over and seemed to completely envelop Dongqing Rushi. Yizhou. In the gradually slanting sunlight, a black Rolls-Royce slowly drove into the hidden Dragon Sea and finally stopped in front of Jinqiu Pavilion. There was no secretary in front of the solemn gate of Jinqiu Pavilion. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State stood at the door and looked at the approaching Rolls-Royce with a smile. A silent woman with an extremely fierce aura quickly got out of the car and opened the back door of the Rolls-Royce. Summer Solstice, the wife of the patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai, walked out of the car and shook hands with Li Huaqing with a smile. She said softly, "Mr. President, sorry to bother you. Madam, you don't have to be so polite." Li Huaqing shook his head with a smile and reached out his hand. "Please." The hostess of the Wang family of Beihai, who had never stepped into the hidden Dragon Sea for more than 20 years, smiled lightly. But there was a kind of sharpness that seemed to have been forgotten gradually coming out of her. She was dignified and elegant, but irresistible. At the same time, under the sky of Beihai in the laboratory of Mount Dibing, beside the huge bronze tripod, Wang Xiaoyao, who had been silent for a long time in the dark world and even in Zhongzhou State, put a box in the bronze tripod with a solemn face. The gigantic coldness of the 9 states stood there quietly, but the natural sword chi broke through the extremely sturdy box without anyone activating it. A black arm guard came out of the box. The arm guard began to spread slowly with unparalleled spirituality, and wrapped around the coldness of 9 states. The broad body of the coldness of 9 states suddenly buzzed. In an instant, invisible but extremely sharp sword energy flew in every corner of the laboratory hall. Wang Xiaoyao watched this scene quietly. The black sword kept trembling. On the body of the sword, the sun, moon, stars, mountains, rivers, lakes, and seas seemed to be alive and became extremely vivid. The sword energy became more and more violent, but it was extremely sharp and clear. Looking at this scene, Wang Xiaoyao suddenly felt a little emotional. This was the first fusion of the divine weapon and the murderous weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. At this moment, was the human emperor moving? Or was the coldness of 9 states moving? He pressed a button beside him. A light shield gradually rose from the huge bronze tripod. The misty blue light rose and gradually enveloped the human emperor and the coldness of 9 states. It was sunny in Lin'an. The former lonely mountain had become today's Southeast Supervisory Council. The main building of the Supervisory Council had been completed. The engineering corps from the Lin and military region were still repairing other facilities in the Supervisory Council day and night. Li Honghe, dressed in plain clothes, sat quietly on a bluestone in the Supervisory Council, facing West Lake, silently watching the sun gradually setting in the west. In the dim light and shadow, an old man with a serious and dignified expression appeared. Li Honghe was stunned and smiled softly. The old man was followed by a few meticulous guards. The guards didn't stop until they got close to Li Honghe. The old man came over and sat down beside Li Honghe. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Can't sit still? Li Honghe glanced at him and said with a soft laugh. Reki City? The old man frowned tightly. The situation is not good. No, for us the situation tonight is the best. Li Honghe smiled and suddenly said, Do you believe me or not? The old man glanced at him and thought, Is it nonsense? Li Honghe seemed to have gotten the answer. He nodded and said, Since you believe me, stay for dinner tonight. When this big show is over, everything should be clear. At the same time, it was almost evening in Jianghu State. In the strong wind and heavy rain at Reki City International Airport, Qin Weibai also boarded the plane to Lin and Jianghu State. There was no flaming fire beside her. There was no Lin Fengting. She was alone. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.